Welcome once again to the metropolis-covered world of Ravnica. City of Guilds, birthplace of the what's-a-tizer glove, home of the Aeromunculus, the automated Aeromunculus, and...
I want to say Batman?
After getting distracted by other videos that I made instead, and since March of the Machine almost drowned my investment in the current Magic canon in a shallow pool of non-functioning oil,
I will never forgive that set.
It's finally time to get back to the series that started the channel! The one where we take an extensive look at the lore of Magic's popular city world, from an angle that considers the commoners of the plane. All those people who didn't make it into the set name. And Christ, am I excited to talk about some Magic sets that didn't disappoint me. War of the Spark is next video. Just like in the previous installments of this series, we're going to take an extended tour through the streets of Ravnica, examining everything with an ungilded lens, to come to know the plane and its people from the ground up. And these are the shiniest, most recent iteration of Ravnica streets that there are. And that was true when I said that when I filmed it ages ago. We'll talk about the new Murders at Karlov Manor set in a future Guildless video. Back to you, the past. For the third video in this series, we're going to be looking at the third Ravnica block, and specifically, the first two sets, Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance. War of the Spark is next video. I've definitely gone into more detail this time than I did in either of the previous Guildless videos, but the two sets really deserve it, and with all the extended media connected to the third Ravnica block, there's a whole lot to talk about. Whilst the Guildless people of Ravnica have always existed as a semi-oppressed underclass of the city. In the previous video on the second Ravnica block, we learned how the Guildless were given a coherent aesthetic, and how that allowed them to work as effective windows into the plain city life, elevating them above the status they had in the original block as little more than neglected tools of the setting. In this third Ravnica block, with distrust hanging over the city, thicker than fog, how are the ungilded presented this time around? And how will they fare as the rulers of their world forego their civic duties to all menacingly point their weapons at each other's faces? Unless someone stops me in the next little bit of time, I'm going to see about answering those questions. I'm briefly mentioning my Patreon here because I'm poor and I don't yet have sponsors. Thank you, lovely patrons. Why not become one? You. Anyway, back to the thing. Returning to Ravnica, but not that one. Guilds of Ravnica, the set, released in October 2012, with Ravnica Allegiance releasing in January of the following year. I'll probably forget what I'm about to say during this at some point, and collectively refer to these two sets and the following War of the Spark as the Guilds of Ravnica block, but they aren't technically that. For a few years leading up to Guilds of Ravnica, Wizards had been using a different release model wherein blocks didn't contain 3 sets as they had in the past and had in the previous 2 Ravnica blocks, but instead only contained 2 sets. This release model changed yet again a little before Guilds of Ravnica released, and blocks were eliminated entirely. The release model has changed slightly since then, but we're still effectively living in the blockless era. With the release of Dominaria in 2018, Magic was no longer bound to a single setting for more than 1 set at a time. This didn't necessarily mean that we'd only have 1 set per setting, and in theory, the game could linger on a single setting for as many sets as the story needed. But in practice, it typically has meant that, and one and done is what you can expect setting-wise from most Magic sets nowadays. None of the new settings released since this model was introduced have gotten more than 1 set to their name,
Except for Eldraine, now 4 years later.
And all have suffered as a result. The big exception to this was the Guilds of Ravnica not block. Then, despite the blockless schedule, Magic actually did linger in 1 setting for 3 whole sets in a row, just like a good old-fashioned oldie block. Though this isn't technically a block, to be clear. The sets don't have quite the same mechanical overlap that a regular block does, but they're still 3 concurrent Ravnica sets, so for simplicity's sake, I am going to call them Guilds of Ravnica block. Wizards' intentions for these Ravnica sets were made pretty clear in the articles that accompanied them. For the past few years under the 2-set block model, Magic's story had been running a consistent narrative and was ramping towards a conclusion. Since the release of Kaladesh in 2016, Magic's Avengers-esque central cast of Planeswalkers, aka the Gatewatch, had been gearing up to face the villainous, Machiavellian, and immensely powerful Nicol Bolas. A dragon Planeswalker, amongst the oldest of them all, and a figure from far back in the game's past, Bolas desired a godlike dominion over the multiverse. Over several blocks, his schemes had been unfolding around the Gatewatch, and their efforts to understand or prevent them hadn't gone particularly well. I'll delve deeper into this period of Magic in the following video, but going into Guilds of Ravnica, the player base knew that Bolas's big plan was coming to fruition, and the Gatewatch were gearing up to take him down. WotC wanted the site of the final chapter of the Bolas arc to be somewhere that players really cared about. Many different planes have resonated well with players over the years, but there really is only one answer to which one resonates the best. Ravnica has been a huge hit with players since its debut, reinvigorating the game, becoming a template for future multicolor sets, and regularly coming out on top in the player feedback that WotC seek on all the planes they create. For the site of the big finale to be important, and for players to connect with the jeopardy the setting was in, Ravnica was the best choice. But WotC also suspected that players wouldn't be happy with a return to Ravnica where the guilds weren't the focus. Ravnica has perhaps the strongest mechanical identity of any plane through the success of the guild model gameplay, and Mark Rosewater, this block's design lead, had written previously how he believed that the weak reception that Battle for Zendikar had received a few years ago was at least in part due to that set not maintaining the mechanical identity of the previous Zendikar block. So dumping Ravnica's mechanics in favor of the Planeswalkers wasn't something that WotC was excited to do, especially with a formula as tried and true as the guilds. Personally, I always thought Marrow learned the wrong lesson from Battle for Zendikar though, and if Magic settings are gonna stay interesting, they have to grow and change eventually, even if that means beyond their original identity. Battle for Zendikar was bad because the cards were bad, and Zendikar Rising might have been a better set and truer to the original, but the flavor was so dull I can barely think about it long enough to finish this sentence. When it comes to a beast as pristine as Ravnica though, I can understand not wanting to fuck with it, and in the interest of not breaking what isn't broke, it was decided that 2 sets would run on Ravnica before the third that was the big story finale. At least 2 sets are needed to squeeze in all the guilds, so the same model that was used for the first 2 sets of Return to Ravnica block was implemented again. Rosewater further details in the article that I'm paraphrasing how early on it was decided that these 2 preceding Ravnica sets would be designed similarly to those that came before and draw on the strengths of the previous Ravnica blocks. Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance want to deliver the player a classic Ravnica experience, similarly to the goals of Return to Ravnica block, but even more laser focused than before. Addressing all that aforementioned accrued popularity over the years, the new Ravnica sets wanted to draw on the nostalgia of already established players. Rather than trying to beat nostalgia and define what Ravnica was, concept artist Titus Lunter said that it was more important to figure out what Ravnica meant to people and how they experienced it. And so this nostalgic sentiment ran throughout the 2 sets. This is expertly outlined in the Rhystic Studies video I'm briefly ripping off, but it was a feeling that was difficult to avoid if you were following the game at the time and familiar with the city plane. The smaller side of Ravnica is in even greater focus, bringing to the forefront the relatability of city life. And many of the cards feature characters that peer through the frame to address the viewer directly, placing us on the street. The style guide, I think now called a world guide, made it clear to all the artists working on the sets that it was autumn on Ravnica. The wet streets, obscuring blue-grey mists, and orange leaves reflecting the real world of Guilds of Ravnica's early October release. The basics for Guilds of Ravnica by Richard Wright showed the same scenes as a previous cycle he'd produced for Return to Ravnica, now updated to fit the season. Often diffused and veiled by the murk of the atmosphere, the sun occasionally cuts through the constant overcast to bathe the city in a nostalgic amber. This is Ravnica as we remember it, the idealized vision from our yearning memories. The autumnal setting did a good job bringing Ravnica closer than ever, but it served the dual purpose tonally. The clouds are sporadically pierced by halcyon rays, but the oppressive grey seeps down from the skyline to hang over the pavement, masking the city with an eerie stillness that cannot last.
Fog haunts the streets, rendering the familiar as otherworldly, changing neighbors into shadows and muffling cries for help.
Lightning severs the atmosphere even easier than the sun, and interspersed storms churn above, hinting that worse is yet to come. WotC wanted these sets to have a film noir feel, building an atmosphere of mystery and distrust, to which the autumn lighting lent its haze and its long, deep shadows. Distrust and tension between guilds is a theme of every Ravnica set, but here the mood is leading. It's building. Guild hostility is being elevated, manipulated by hands unseen to most Ravnicans. For the first time, something beyond the scope of the guilds is on the city's horizon. Nicol Bolas is coming to Ravnica. Dragons approach. At the beginning of Guilds of Ravnica, as we fade in on the establishing shot of the skyline, we find a Ravnica that's been fending for itself for quite some time. Jace, the living guild pact, the closest thing that Ravnica has to a de facto leader, is characteristically off-plane. Sometime after becoming the living guild pact, Jace left Ravnica to deal with the interplanar threat of the Eldrazi with a group of other planeswalkers. When preparing to fight 2 of the Eldrazi titans on the plane of Zendikar, the group decided to make things official and christen themselves the Gatewatch, all swearing oaths to band together and deal with threats across the multiverse that no one else could face whenever the need arose. It's of course a noble goal, and Jace definitely felt some responsibility for the Eldrazi, but tying himself to this extraplanar group of heroes meant that between the end of Return to Ravnica block and Guilds of Ravnica, Jace seemingly hasn't spent much time on his home plane. His position as the sort of kind of protagonist back then didn't really allow him to be a very good guild pact, and during the events of Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance, Jace is not around. So back at our establishing skyline, Jaceless Ravnica is a tense and uncertain place. At least at the beginning of the block, the chamber of the Guild Pact still operates thanks to the efforts of the delegates, representatives, and diplomats that work under the Living Guild Pact, with the goal of mediating between the guilds and maintaining civic peace. But without Jace's ability to amend the magically enforced Guild Pact, the office is an ineffectual figurehead, little more than a gesture towards the ideals it was supposed to embody. Without mediation, guild relations have soured, and the guilds have perhaps less faith in each other now than they had even in the previous Ravnica blocks. Long-standing alliances between guilds have frayed, and distrust is the only commonality amongst them. The constant fear of spies and leaked secrets has led to increased isolationism, and much self-serving reinterpretation of the goals they were originally constructed to perform. At the time of Guilds of Ravnica's release, WotC were publishing the stories that accompanied each set as a series of chapters online. Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance both released alongside chapters published on Wizard's site. But instead of telling the story of the lead up to Bolus's arrival, the online chapters were a series of disconnected short stories, each following lower ranking members of each of the guilds. We'll look at those chapters later, but for now, what's worth noting is that for the first 2 sets of Guilds of Ravnica block, those chapters were all the story we got. Save of course for the cards themselves, and specifically the story spotlight cards that show up in each set with a little indicator that they depict an important moment in the plot.
as well as a Planeswalker symbol where the guild watermark would be.
4 of these cards were released with Guilds of Ravnica and 4 with Ravnica Allegiance. And given how the online chapters provided no information towards these spotlight cards or Bolus's encroachment in general, obsessively examining and extrapolating out from these cards was the only way for the story-focused players to keep abreast of the unfolding narrative at the time. And to make things even easier, for the first time, WotC decided not to number these story spotlight cards, so no one had any idea what order they take place in. We'll dig into that as well, and this is definitely going to add to the video's length, but I want to present the story to you both as it first appeared and in the complete form that we eventually got it in. So for now, here's the best interpretation of what we had at the time.
Ral's storm crackled with mystical detections. Planeswalkers were infiltrating Ravnica.
In Thousand Year Storm, we see the Izzet Planeswalker Ralzarek's Project Lightning Bug in action. We met Ral in the last Ravnica block, where he served as a rival-flavored antagonist for Jace. He's a storm mage with the power to control lightning, though not create it. Ral developed Project Lightning Bug in a story a little after that block, a system for detecting planeswalkers coming and going from Ravnica. Its original purpose was to track the movements of the Living Guild Pact, but we can see it here informing Ral that other planeswalkers are infiltrating the plane. Nicol Bolas was heavily associated with his planeswalker minions. Whilst the Bolas arc began in proper with Kaladesh, Bolas first appeared many years before and resurfaced as a villain in 2008's Alara. Since then, he had mostly cackled in the background, whilst little reminders of him were drip-fed, and his influence was felt through his lackeys. Across the years, Bolas broke many planeswalkers to his will, and they served as his often reluctant subordinates, bowed by the dragon with promises, threats, gifts with attached obligations, and his immense power. Going into Guilds of Ravnica, we knew that the Artificer Tezzeret and Ravnica's own Vraska and Ralzarek were all connected to Bolas. Half of the guilds would have their leaders replaced with planeswalkers across the block, all affiliated with Bolas. WotC had 2 appear in the first set and 3 in the second to indicate the worsening situation.
In a climate of suspicion, Isperia gathered the guilds to propose a radical idea: cooperation.
At the Guild Summit, the guild leaders and their representatives gather to try to ease the rising climate, and we're reminded just how massive the Azorius leader, Isperia, is. The infiltrating planeswalkers are clearly making enough waves to draw the guilds into an action they don't really take as readily as they should, but we can see in Assassin's Trophy why it's such a rarity.
A power vacuum for the Azorius, a keepsake for Vraska.
Vraska, the Golgari Gorgon assassin planeswalker we saw terrorizing Jace in the previous Ravnica block, has become the head of the guild since then. Bolas recruited her in the Ixalan block to captain a pirate ship on that plane and locate the Immortal Sun, a piece of his big scheme, in exchange for leadership over her guild. Vraska brought the artifact to the dragon, who then delivered poor Jared to her. The elf lich who'd led the guild since the first block finally met his end, and the Gorgon became queen. Vraska's true intentions were actually opposed to Bolas, and she became less and less like the villain she was in Return to Ravnica across the Ixalan block. But in a story I will get into next video, this thing has so many parts, sealed off a piece of her memory from herself to hide her planned insubordination from the dragon. With her new perspective and the growth she underwent missing from her mind, Vraska's returning to her old assassin-y self, killing the giant sphinx Isperia with her gaze of stone. Vraska had always opposed the power structures of Ravnica and was unjustly persecuted by the Azorius in the past. Whether or not she's following the dragon's orders, she seems to be enacting his will. The guilds tried to come together, but instead the head of the plane's governing body was removed. Niv Mizzet, the Firemind, Paran and leader of the Izzet, has retreated from his duties in Guilds of Ravnica, leaving Ralzarek in charge, and we can see that, in his absence, the Firemind is completing some research of his own. though with little context given. Perhaps he's retreated to keep his findings from Ral himself. Moving on to Ravnica Allegiance, we have Kaya's Wrath, where the Planeswalker control of Ravnica grows. An assassin of ghosts who'd first appeared in the second conspiracy set. Kaya has clearly been hired by Bolas to eliminate the ruling Ghost Council of the Orzhov
and take their place as the Syndicate's new guild leader. Teysa convened the meeting of the Obsidat. Kaya ended it.
Teysa Karlov, who's been around since the first block, used to serve as an envoy to the Ghost Council her grandfather was a member of. She was imprisoned for attempting to overthrow them after the last block, and she seems to be backing Kaya's scheme now. Post Kaya's usurpation of the guild, we can see the two of them together in the next story spotlight, Ethereal Absolution.
Time to let the dead be dead. Kaya to Teysa.
Whether or not Teysa is on board, Kaya seemingly can't let the Orzhov's institutionalized ghost debt slavery continue, and frees at least many of the guild's indentured spirits from their contracts. I've decided I'm going to stop saying Orzhov and just say Orzhov like most people do. I'll stop.
And I shouldn't have, because I was right!
Ravnica Allegiance Mechanic Spotlight, the Orzhov Syndicate.
So the Orzhov Syndicate,
And I'm up to the Orzhov Syndicate.
The Orzhov Syndicate skillfully restored the facade of piety.
Orzhov was right all along, and now it's pronounced wrong for this whole bloody video. Because I listened to other people who were wrong, and I didn't have enough faith in myself, or my memory of Lazav in that trailer.
The Orzhov.
Don't make my mistake, kids. Let's have faith in ourselves. Let's totally be ourselves.
The new guild leader is making changes that fly in the face of the predatory values of the guild. And whilst this moment represents the end of untold suffering, particularly enacted against the city's least privileged, it also represents even more upheaval to Ravnica's status quo, as the Orzhov lose a hugely valuable asset and likely a large chunk of their power. Whether or not Bolas's orders are responsible for the Ethereal Absolution isn't clear, but his association brings an ominous tone to what would otherwise be a moment worth celebrating. Destabilizing the worst of the city's powerful is probably a good thing regardless, but perhaps less so when greater evil lurks just over the horizon. Making the most of all this chaos whilst contributing to it even more, the Gruul clans are rampaging through the streets, doing what the Gruul do best. Domri Raid, a young Ravnican, but also a Bolas insert, has seemingly deposed Borborygmus, the former head of the largest clan, and has at least in part united the typically independent Gruul clans to run amok through the city together, destroying every artifact and enchantment in sight and leaving only 3/3 centaurs in their wake. Wherever Bolas's agents tread, disarray follows.
Even from afar, the dragon's influence is already upturning the lives of Ravnica's people. The Gruul have never been friends to the Guildless, and Siddharth Chaturvedi's stunning card art for Rampage of the Clans highlights the suffering the Gruul cause to Ravnica's commoners in the foreground. In the aftermath of the turmoil, the brand new Azorius guild leader is extending his reach and giving himself emergency powers. Quickly promoted after the petrification of Asperia, Grand Arbiter Dovin Baan marks the 5th Planeswalker guild leader with ties to the dragon, whose horns we see evoked on the spotlight card. A former member of the government of the Plane of Kaladesh. Here the Vedalken is using his impressive ability to discern a system's flaws to change the city's governing body from within. Increased authoritarianism and surveillance become hallmarks of Baan's tenure over the guild, with Thopters and precognition mages enforcing order with a draconian hand. What better way for Bolas to gain power on the plane than installing a puppet at the top of its central government? I remember feeling really tense and uneasy watching these story moments play out without written context. For every set leading up to this, the story had released alongside it online and followed the actions of the Gatewatch in their entirety. But now with the Gatewatch absent and only the unrelated shorts releasing with the Ravnica sets, the main plot had left with the Planeswalkers. Now more than ever, with everything building to a head, the story's absence was anxiety-inducing. And strangely, at least at the time, it kind of worked. The missing story would cause a lot of problems when War of the Spark rolled around, but during the preceding 2 sets, it felt oddly grounding. The unease the absence generated made the growing tension depicted on Ravnica even more relatable. Ravnica's general population have very little knowledge of the actions of the guild leaders on any given day, and had almost no knowledge of Bolas or his coming arrival. And now we were also being limited only to the information that was available to the Ravnicans. I remember feeling like just another peon tucked amongst the alleyways, with only scant knowledge of the city's most fiery events, and no idea of what had kindled them or where their flames might spread. So as much as it would have been better if the later released prequel story that fleshed out those events in full released at an appropriate time, like alongside Ravnica Allegiance, instead of after War of the Spark like it did, at least for that short period of time, the missing story did generate some strangely thematic emotions. That prequel story did eventually come out though, and finally give us the story for these sets, and all the context we'd been missing. The Gathering Storm.
My bloody light fell over for that whole first bit. I didn't even notice. So now enjoy slightly better lighting. The 20-chapter prequel novel to War of the Spark, The Gathering Storm by Django Wexler, started releasing in July 2019 as a weekly newsletter from Random House Publishing, wrapping up in October of that year. The speculation as to whether this was actually supposed to be a prequel novel or was just delayed stems partially from the strange release model for this book, which was far longer than any of the chapters Wizards typically post on their site, and unlike those, was being released as a newsletter from a separate publisher. On top of that were story beats that the player was assumed to already know about once War of the Spark rolled around, but were entirely missing from the last two sets. Such as Niv Mizzet dying during those sets. That happened, apparently. Firemind Vessel from War of the Spark says so. Though it wasn't on guilds or allegiances cards or anything else anywhere. The death of the most iconic Ravnican wasn't worth a story spotlight. Regardless, the vital context the Gathering Storm provided, combined with its weird release, do very much make it seem like it was delayed. The book follows three protagonists, perhaps for this period, the most important people in Ravnica. Vraska, Kaya, and Ral Zarek. Three of the five Planeswalker inserts with draconic associations. And here we learn that each of the three is a far less willing lackey for Bolas than they might have appeared during the two new Ravnica sets. The story follows the basic events of the Spotlight cards for the most part, but now everything is given so much delicious context, and the book utilizes all the lovely space available to it in 20 chapters to flesh out the perspectives of each member of its central cast. Now we can see that despite the dragon playing a benefactor role to Ral in the past, the Izzet Viceroy has actually sworn off all ties to Bolas prior to the novel. Ral openly rejects Bolas's orders and spends both sets actively working against the dragon more so than anyone else in Ravnica. Ral is the book's real main character. He gets more focused than the other two, the story delves deeper into his past and into his then currently casual but potentially romantic relationship with the Orzhov advocist Tomik Vrona, and his actions drive the major plot the most. Niv Mizzet's not hiding from Ral. He promoted him out of necessity and genuine suitability. The pair of them know that Bolas plans to invade the city world, and throughout the novel, Ral and the Firemind both work towards the same goal, turning Niv Mizzet into the living Guild Pact. Beleren, Ral said, but he's gone, and no one knows when or if he will return. Without him, we are trapped. There is a final failsafe. Niv Mizzet went on, the Guild Pact can be altered. Altered? Is that possible? With the agreement of all 10 guild leaders. Another humorless chuckle. You can see why it has never been done. Mizzet believes that if he can become the living Guild Pact, he can make himself powerful enough to take Bolas down one-on-one. The Izzet Parent is still potentially the most powerful being on the plane, but he isn't Nicol Bolas strong, at least not until he can kick Jace out of a job. And even then, utilizing the magical might of the Guild Pact, it's not a certainty that Niv can bring the Elder Dragon down. And the pair even construct an interplanar beacon to hopefully summon Planeswalker aid as a backup plan. Combining the research of Ral's Project Lightning Bug with an idea the Firemind had in a dream. But the Guild Pact thing's still the best shot they've got, goddammit, and by Azor's main, they're gonna take it. Initially, Mizzet gives Ral the task of bringing the guilds together.
Hopefully so they can all agree to the Niv Mizzet Guild Pact plan.
And Ral spends the first half of the novel trying to bring about the summit of the guilds. Running around the 10th, meeting with guild leaders and their representatives, whilst trying to uncover more about Bolas's plan amidst the Elder Dragon's constant efforts to stop him through a string of possessed Ravnicans. Early on, Ral meets with a renegade, Lavinia. The former Azorius Arrester and Jace's aide at the Guild Pact office is investigating agents of a foreign power. She's gone rogue and fled her official positions as she can no longer tell who above her is answering to the impending dragon. She becomes a constant source of covert info for Ral throughout the book, often cautioning him against trusting those in power. A more constant in Ral's life from this point on is the Rakdos emissary, Hekara. Upon receiving word of Niv's plan, Rakdos is surprisingly on board provided everything is above board, and sends his emissary to shadow Ral until the summit. Hekara, the cheery jester lady, quickly becomes very fond of Ral, even if it isn't quite returned, and she's by his side for most of the book's events, providing a little bit of violence and a lot of comic relief. She maybe verges on annoying a few times, but for the most part Hekara was fun. Hope she gets a card. Ral also meets the book's other POV characters in the first few chapters. After Vraska's successful Golgari coup d'etat, both her and Ral help out with Teysa and Kaya's coup against the Orzhov. Up to the novel's midway point, things are going pretty well for the Ravnicans and their efforts against the coming invader. The book's 3 POV characters are all on board, each agreeing to the summit and Ral's Guild Pact plan, and all united in their desire to stop Bolas. Teysa originally agreed to attend the summit with the promise of Ral's help with the coup, but for Kaya, what was supposed to be just another simple ghost assassination job has come with with far more consequences than her draconic client confessed. Upon killing the Ghost Council, Kaya unknowingly becomes them. She'd sooner just up and leave now, thanks, but the magical ties that bind her to her new position have the potential to kill her if she leaves the plane, as Teysa warns. It doesn't seem to be an ideal situation for Teysa, but how much she really knows isn't clear. Despite Bolas's offer to fix her home plane's broken sky, Kaya's trust in the dragon has dissolved, and she's happy to align the Orzhov with Ral. Vraska, on the other hand, starts the book fully on board with Lord Bolas, happily killing the Golgari leader Jared in a minor retcon with the dragon's blessing. The Swarm had recently uncovered a mass of mysterious, elegantly attired, undead servants from deep in the plane's past. The Erstwhile. And the Devkarin elves, the ruling society of the Golgari, had become obsessed with them, installing them everywhere. Bolas gave Vraska the reins to the Erstwhile, and with them, she took the reins to the guild. Although shortly after she sat herself atop a throne of petrified elves, she accidentally discovers that magical block within her mind, thanks to her telepathic insect friend. And sooner than her past self intended, lets all of her locked-off memories from her time in Ixalan block come flooding back. With her character growth and her intent to stop the dragon restored, Vraska allies the Golgari to Ral's guild-uniting plan. Many of the guild leaders appear at the summit, and the rest send representatives, and for the first day of proceedings, things go fairly well. There's obviously disagreement amongst them, and some guilds are relatively resistant, but the impending threat of Nicol Bolas is outlined to all of them, and most guilds seem to be coming around to Niv Mizzet's plan. But unfortunately for Vraska, and soon everybody, just prior to her arrival at the summit, Bolas paid Vraska a visit. Speaking through the body of a young elf assassin, the dragon demonstrates just how much power he holds over the Gorgon. The elf snapped something fast in a language Vraska didn't understand. The 4 zombies which had advanced to take hold of him stopped in their tracks.
Imagine every erstwhile turning on its master, just as they did to Jared and his elves,
Bolas said.
but this would be so much worse. Everything you love would be torn to pieces.
With the claws around her neck revealed, Vraska falls in line. Leaning into her past self to make what she has to do at least easier, Vraska meets with the Azorius leader Isperia in the summit hall after hours. Vraska questions the Sphinx about her involvement in the violent oppression that Vraska faced from the Azorius as a teenager, and finds Isperia resolute in her decision to round up and imprison innocent Golgari. The Golgari had grown dangerous and the balance was threatened. The Senate has to act in the best interests of Ravnica. You'd do it again, if necessary. I thought so, Vraska sighed. As the Sphinx dies to her petrifying gaze, at least Vraska can weigh some personal justification against the guilt of betraying Ravnica and herself. When the summit reconvenes in the morning, only to find Isperia dead, the negotiations cease and the guilds retreat to bunker down. All seems lost for Ral and Niv's plan, but in that moment of hopelessness, Ral has an epiphany. The implicit maze, the series of ley lines that ran throughout each of the guild's territories in the 10th district, was the system that the Guild Pact's author, Azor, implemented to ensure that the Guild Pact could be reinstated if it ever failed. The maze was uncovered last block, and its completion, requiring the cooperation of all 10 guilds, led to the creation of a new pact within the currently off-world Jace. Ral believes that if they can hack into the maze's ley lines by embedding is-it-constructed nodes of his design, they can create a machine that spans the 10th and allows the Guild Pact to be altered without the co-signing of all the guilds. The Niving Guild Pact plan continues. The majority of the guilds agree to Ral's new plan, even the Azorius' mysterious new leader. And Nivix is abuzz as the entirety of the Izzet Guild work towards the project, and Izzet teams are installed inside each of the aligned guilds to construct each part of the machine. The only problems being the 2 nodes that need to be installed in hostile territories, the Gruul and the Golgaris. Vraska's obviously reluctantly opposed to Ral's new plan, and whilst the Gruul's now former leader Borborigmus attended the summit as a favour to Niv Mizzet, he's recently been deposed by the new upstart Domri Raid. Neither of the 2 new Bolas-aligned guild leaders will allow the other guilds into their domains without a fight. And fight they do as Ral presses into both of their territories with the might of the Izzet and the backing of the Azorius, the Boros, and the Orzhov.
And we all briefly forget that we're cheering for the established guilds to force the maligned ones back in line. But they were doing dragon shit, to be fair, and you can't be doing dragon shit in this day and age.
In each, though the battles are fierce, the Guild Alliance succeeds, and the nodes are installed, defended, and protected against counterattacks. The latter and closer of those 2 combats takes place in the Undercity, where Vraska has prepared for the overworld invaders, flooding them with undead and rot and collapsing an ancient city on them. Ral only makes it through thanks to the intervention of the Boros leader, the mighty angel Aurelia. And Vraska only escapes the angel thanks to the death of her poor telepathic insect pal. With the only real friend she had in her court dead, Vraska is pushed even further from her former allies. Once all the nodes are in, Kaya's plot briefly takes the focus again, as Ral's kind of maybe, I don't want to say it first, you say it first, boyfriend Tomik helps her escape the clutches of the Orzhov oligarchs who seek to oust her. Ral shows up to rescue them both and, danger averted, Kaya returns to the Orzhov Guild Hall to show the Church of Deals just who's really in charge now and brings them under heel. It's really satisfying. We'll talk about it later, which is my catchphrase. With that out of the way and all the nodes still in place, it's finally time to flip a switch and ascend a dragon. The nice one. But alas, and inevitably, the plan fails. As the switch is flipped, the machine in Nivix explodes, which you'd think might just be expected of an Izzet machine, but they were really careful this time, and time is something they're completely out of. Ral finds that the surge that ruined the plan originated at the Azorius Guild Hall, and Niv confirms what Zarek fears. The Azorius Guild leader Dovin Barn has betrayed them. With the second plan in tatters, Nicol Bolas arrives as a great portal opens over the 10th. All that's left to do is fall back on contingencies. Ral, Kaya, and the Rakdos representative Hakara all head to activate the Azorius Guarded into Planar Beacon, whilst Niv Mizzet heads out to delay the Elder Dragon above the center of the city. The Firemind knows he likely won't survive, but no one else even has a chance against the invader, and he's all out of time. So in what was probably my favorite duel in a Magic story, at least since Sorin got walled, the two dragons fight for the fate of the world.
Niv Mizzet, he said, the vaunted Firemind. I always knew you were the only one on this benighted world that would give me a proper fight. I am glad, Niv Mizzet said, not to disappoint. I don't suppose there's any point in asking you to submit. Go back through that portal and close it behind you, Niv Mizzet rumbled, and I may let you live. Very good, Bolas said with a chuckle. And so we begin.
It really is an incredibly satisfying clash to read. Django Wexler gives the event the grandiosity it deserves, and the descriptions of the two dragons' conflict and the devastation it causes below are as vivid and dramatic as they are clear and pacey. It's framed from Niv's perspective, and whilst the Firemind absolutely respects the power of Bolas and has clearly put in a lot of other non-Guild Pact prep specifically for this moment, I do love how snootily the Firemind regards Bolas's more humanoid body. He was misshapen to Niv Mizzet's mind, standing on two legs with his face flattened and broad, human-like mouth and features. There was entirely too much of the human about Bolas for the Firemind's taste. Humans were all well and good, Niv Mizzet thought, but he wouldn't want to be one. His flight was inelegant. Bipeds weren't suited for wings, Niv Mizzet thought with a sniff. Across the section of the fight we get to read, Niv is actually the better fighter of the two. He evades and counters Bolas repeatedly, a psychic assault that was supposed to fry Niv's brain dead, instead glancing off the Firemind's mental barriers, leaving Bolas stunned. And his attacks are more unpredictable and land more often, catching the Elder Dragon off guard and even knocking him on his ass a few times. As soon as Nicol is finished stepping through his portal, Niv opens the fight with a city-spanning version of Electro Dominance. Basically, we turn a bunch of little lightnings into one big lightning. Except it's all big lightnings from secret gigantic Mizium coils hidden all around the 10th, channeled together, focused through lenses into the densest lightning ever, and shot at the Elder Dragon, punching him out the sky and a big hole in the city. Later, Niv uses his knowledge of the city to pummel the Elder Dragon into an open Simic Zonnet that Bolas doesn't see until he's already falling into it. Before the invader can rise from the watery depths, Niv obliterates the rim of the Zonnet with fire, dropping overhanging buildings and tons of debris on top of Bolas. Of course, it's to little avail, and every time the Planeswalker shrugs off another of Mizzet's should-be devastating assaults, and the Firemind feels his power in response, he's reminded of the truth that his arrogance has been trying to obscure. Deep down, Niv realized he had always believed that Bolas had made an error, that when they came head-to-head, the Elder Dragon would find himself overmatched. The realization that Bolas had the power to back up his words was profoundly unsettling. Niv looked back up at him. He felt something strange, an emotion unfamiliar to him. Long moments passed as he considered it. Fear, he decided. So this was what fear was like. It was, Niv Mizzet thought, unworthy of the Firemind. So he pushed it aside, roared his defiance, and leapt skyward, even as tendrils of death and destruction unfolded from Bolas's outstretched hands. Back to Ral's team as they reach the beacon tower with the help of a wandering Rakdos circus. Clowns fight cops as Ral, Kaya, and Hakara advance up the tower. Waiting for them is their ex-ally Vraska and a Bolas-possessed Lavinia. A tense fight ensues, made more difficult by Ral's desire not to hurt the Bolas-possessed Lavinia, and poor Hakara dies to the mind-warped renegade sword, saving Ral. He breaks Bolas's hold over Lavinia, and the dragon's spirit avatar, responsible for the possessions across the story, emerges to find a new host. Before it can, Kaya does what she does best, and stabs the spirit to real death. Just like how fights progress in media, Vraska uses the opportunity to knock Kaya unconscious. Then it's just her and Ral. The sting of the disillusion of their previous allyship is in both Planeswalkers' attacks as they clash. Ral tries one last time to talk Vraska around, as surely she doesn't trust Bolas or whatever he's offered her. Vraska confesses that she knows the dragon will likely betray her, but his power is so immense that she's long since accepted submission as the only option to save her guild. So Ral makes a hole in the roof by running his electricity through the building's wiring, allowing the storm above to tear through the ceiling and down into his hands. As Vraska planeswalks away from the lightning, Ral is free to activate the interplanar beacon.
The button was, of course, bright red. What Izzet engineer could resist?
At least with the contingency plan enacted, Ravnica has a shred of hope. Although a final section from the perspective of Bolas's minion Tezzeret has two pieces of bad news for the city plane. In one hand he held a huge white skull, which could only have belonged to another dragon nearly as large as Bolas himself. Scoured clean of flesh, it rested in the palm of Bolas's enormous hand, and Bolas regarded it with a mixture of pride and something like sadness. Ravnica's strongest protector was indeed correct about who would win the duel, and that's not even the worst of it.
And the beacon?
Bolas had to know. Tezzeret had known the moment it had happened. The beacon burned bright in his mind, a bright flame visible to any planeswalker, an invitation to Ravnica. He cleared his throat. He has activated it, Master. I see. A slow smile spread across the dragon's enormous face. Then everything is going according to plan. Everyone's been played. At the very beginning of the story, we saw a mind-controlled Dimir spy sneak into Nivix and plant an idea in the sleeping Firemind's head. Lazav claimed no responsibility for the spy, and we can see that for once he was actually being honest. The beacon itself was Bolas's idea, and what was supposed to be the last lifeline for the plane is actually just another part of the dragon's plan. Storms churn above Ravnica, but the worst is already here. The Gathering Storm is really good. It's a great story. That isn't necessarily a particularly high bar for a Magic story, but The Gathering Storm is amongst the best I've read within the canon. It's my favorite Ravnica story now, and I really like the original novels. I'm not sure anything in any Magic story will ever beat the moment when Thon and Birukazir saved the day at the end of City of Guilds, but The Gathering Storm is better overall. The events are well paced and executed, something's always happening whilst always feeding into the larger plot. Even the flashbacks are full of relevant information. There's no wasted time, and the pace lends urgency to the city's situation. All three of the central cast are compelling and unique, and their actions drive the narrative. But on top of that, every character felt true to their previous showings, and sometimes even surpassed them, and changed or developed how I saw them for the better. Inconsistent characters will be a feature of the next video, and I got annoyed at how dumb many of the guild leaders came off in The Secretist, but here they were all handled really well.
There were a surprising amount of typos and grammatical errors, and the frequency did just about reach the point where it was affecting my enjoyment of the story, though only mildly. I guess whoever edited this could have done a bit more editing. But that said,
even with War of the Spark and me spoiling the whole thing, I can't recommend it enough. Plus, it's free.
And it was easily findable and readable online until recently. But now, the link to the chapter archive I was using and was going to provide leads to a blank page. Balls. I tried putting it into the Wayback Machine, and the page loads, but then none of the chapters do. Balls. Currently, there is no way to actually buy this story, although I really wouldn't put it past WotC to start selling it eventually. So I don't feel bad recommending that you find The Gathering Storm through whatever dark means you decide, and it is worth it.
While some of the story spotlights weren't a focus of the story, we have a much better understanding of how their events played out on the whole, and how all the major players affected the game of Ravnica this time. Unlike with the previous stories, the moment-to-moment decisions of our central cast have ramifications that unfurl across the 10th as the book progresses. So having a more complete understanding of them is key to understanding Ravnica during this period, which is why we're going in story first this time around. Hi. It's 2 weeks later now, due to unforeseen circumstances involving cats.
So my hair's longer and I look slightly different in this footage. The cats are fine, by the way. I just got the date. I was supposed to cat sit them wrong.
And then I had to refilm another huge chunk of it again, for stupid reasons at another later date. Today. It's so hot, I'm gonna melt. So there's 3 different me's from different time periods throughout the video. It won't be jarring! It won't be jarring! The Guilds of Ravnica block. With our greens eaten and our feet planted firmly on the cobblestones, it's nearly time to take a look at the guilds in these 2 sets, and how they were represented this time around. From the angle that we always take, the one that says, but what about the ones that ain't them? And there's a lot of sources to draw on this time. The articles from the time, the shorts accompanying the sets, the 3 books, The Gathering Storm, The Art of Magic the Gathering, Ravnica, and The Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, the book that D&D-ified Ravnica, and of course, the actual cards. Those latter 2 books are particularly interesting though, as they weren't something that accompanied either of the previous Ravnica blocks. The Art of Ravnica by James Wyatt features a lot of gorgeously printed art of the city and its people, as well as relatively extensive and detailed descriptions of the guilds and their actions and attitudes in the 3rd Ravnica block. I'm a huge fan of these magic art books that no longer exist, and they're generally a great compendium to grab if you're interested in any of the planes that got a book. I did always wish they featured more concept art and style guide pages, as those parts intrigue me the most, but they're bloody gone now, so I'll just take them as they were if they ever come back, please. To be honest, my biggest wish is that WotC would just publish old style/world guides. I would eat them up. The Guildmaster's Guide, also by James Wyatt, was the first of the Magic D&D conversion books that have released alongside a few Magic sets since. As well as detailing the rules for creating characters that align with the guilds of the city, and offering playable races from amongst those on Ravnica, the book has a ton of information, not just on the guilds and their internal structures, but on the city itself. That map of the 10th district of Ravnica that I use all the time first appeared in this book, and the book has detailed information on each of the district's 6 precincts. We can learn about the neighborhoods, landmarks, and people, and get a general sense of life for the Gilded and the Not in every section of the 10th. There's a ton of information on Ravnica here, probably more than has been collected before in one place, save potentially for the original novels. A lot of the art book is similar to the D&D one, and the 2 books share some text exactly. But for my money, there's actually more lore to dig into with the Guildmaster's Guide. The descriptions of the guilds are more extensive in the Art of Ravnica, I'd say, but there's more information on the city at large in the Guildmaster's Guide. There's also a quick campaign in it featuring Krenko, who I love, so that's ideal. I'll admit I've not had the chance to run or even play it, though I will. So for this examination of the guilds and their impact on the Ungilded, there's probably more raw information available on the guilds than in any previous Ravnica block. Given that, what are they up to in the threequel, and who's feeling it the most? The Azorius Senate. The white-blue Azorius are still in charge as the government of the plane, but this time around they're leaning further into their worst instincts than ever before. With the absence of the Guild Pact, chaos in the streets, and their own guild leader's murder, the guild's driving need for control is only increasing. The Senate has always been divided into 3 columns: legislation, arbitration, and enforcement. But recently the lines between them have blurred as the whole guild is overworked. That 3rd column, the Laev, or Liev, it's that moment again when I have to make a decision on a word I've never heard pronounced. The Laev, I'm going to say Laev because it just sounds the least offensive to me. The Laev that deals with law enforcement has been expanded in size and reach, to the point where it's the most dominant force within the guild. Under the emergency powers granted by the guild's new leader, the guild mages and arresters of the Laev wield disproportionate control within the guild and over the city's people, with a judge-Dreddian level of authority offered to them when determining if laws have been broken and whether sentencing and punishment be dished out on the spot, or even if the growing ranks of the infantry or the hussars need to be deployed. Precognitive mages who had previously occupied a minor role within the guild were elevated by Dovin Baan, and their predictive visions were given similarly elevated weight as evidence for arresting citizens for crimes yet to be committed. In his obsessive need to gain control over the city and perfect the Azorius system, Dovin expanded surveillance in all aspects of the Azorius. Mandatory lockets enable the tracking of all Senate personnel for improved security and efficiency. Dovin Baan.
The Senate griffins overhead used to make people think of order and safety. Not anymore. Lavinia.
Thopters, which are basically drones, are particularly common on Baan's home plane of Kaladesh, where they take a menagerie of forms and serve a multitude of functions in city life and otherwise. Now, on Ravnica, Baan has implemented and standardized his own Thopters to serve as flying CCTV cameras. Well, that's even more efficient than Amir, though definitely less discreet as Dovin's eyes flit across the 10th, day and night, and the whole city recoils from his lidless stare.
Alongside Dovin's eyes destroying everyone's privacy, the Azorius have even begun to use the tools of their predatory contemporaries. In the previous blocks, verity circles were employed by the Orzhov in court, ensuring the speaker within was truthful, and here the Senate has adopted this method of control from the Syndicate.
As much as he's reacting to the climate of fear, Baan's contributing to it tenfold. Ravnica's poorest are absolutely feeling the heel of the Azorius' enlarged boots the most. More cops with more power are applying ever more scrutiny to their citizens' actions and thoughts, and rapidly changing legislation is increasingly less concerned with people than with order, but the Senate's overreach has angered the other guilds as well. Some guilds have always hated the Azorius and opposed them as much as they can get away with, and most have never particularly liked the guild. But in the third Ravnica block, the Azorius have made themselves the enemy of nearly everyone. Whilst few guilds stand opposed to the Azorius, and order on the streets is still typically maintained, with the collapse of Isperia's summit and Dovin's following oppressive regime, the relations between the Azorius and every other guild have soured. No two guilds have ever truly seen eye to eye, but the Azorius' relationship to the other guilds that value order was always stronger than with the rest. Now the Orzhov, who previously the Senate often overlooked or took bribes from, have retreated from contact with the Azorius, keeping their crimes hidden from flying eyes. The Boros Legion had perhaps the strongest connection to the Senate, as the two guilds enforced the law together, but now they distance themselves, regarding the Senate's actions as morally contradictory to the justice the Legion values. Reflectively, the Senate sees them as foolishly idealistic vigilantes, but many Azorius soldiers continue to defect to the Boros.
Whilst the text related to the Azorius this block has no direct mention of the Guildless, we can find them suffering under Barnes' citywide squeeze. The original Ravnica novels made it clear that the Guildless were essentially beneath legal consideration, and Guildless people had little in the way of rights when compared to their gilded counterparts, to the point where murdering them wasn't in of itself a crime. To my knowledge, this has never been commented on in either of the following Ravnica blocks, so my assumption is that this is still the case. Previous iterations of the Senate have mostly shown disinterest to the ungilded, but Dovin seems to want to reach into the daily lives of all his citizens. And unlike with the gilded, the guildless have no institutional protections to stand behind. Hold it! I need to see your papers.
The Azorius of Guilds of Ravnica block represent their most oppressive form to date. The doldrum and mundanity of their intentionally, glacially paced legal proceedings that characterize the Azorius as detached bureaucrats in the previous blocks has taken a back seat to a newly frantic need to grasp for control over the city with progressively invasive means. They've always been depicted as an oppressive and out-of-touch government, but Barnes' Senate is more obsessively and actively Orwellian than any we've seen before. In the original block, Grand Arbiter Augustine IV secretly plotted to gain absolute control over the city, but he kept his intent hidden even from his own guild, unlike the openly increasing authoritarianism of Barnes' reign. Disinterested disregard for the Plains people has been replaced with far too much interest and a desire to force Ravnica's citizens into a tightening system that ignores their humanity where it doesn't exploit it. If the populace fears our authority, then I'd say we have an appropriately sensible populace. Dovin Barn. The Orzhov Syndicate. The Syndicate are back, in black and white. Opulent and imperial and predatory as before, the banking church still has its fingers in almost all business on Ravnica, and still preys on the populace bottom first with loans, taxes, tithes, and much worse. Through the reconstruction of their ostentatious cathedrals, the Orzhov rebuilt their grandiose religious facade last block and still rely on the stature it offers them, and the guilt it helps generate in their indebted followers. With their mask of faith already back in place, the Syndicate has been content to further their exploitation of its veiling benefits. Organized crime has always been a part of the Orzhov operation, but lately has expanded even further. Orzhov businesses and territories can offer at least the image of stability to the population at large, and the Syndicate has leaned into this as another potential avenue to take advantage of. Protection rackets extort money and other assets from those under the Orzhov's thumb, capitalizing on the promise of safety by removing it for those unable to pay. Concurrently, their banking institutions have become an ever more utilized layer for obscuring countless financial crimes. The Syndicate's soured relations with the Azorius are, at least in part, due to the Church's increasingly illegal activities, but their distancing from the White-Blue Guild has only driven them further into criminality and exploitation. Hierarchs of the Orzhov counter Dovin Barnes' increased surveillance with greater degrees of separation and obfuscation, ensuring that however many lesser guild members get arrested, it's never the superiors who take the fall. The Church is in an interesting state in Ravnica allegiance. Whilst their institutions seem to be in pretty good standing, and things were supposedly dandy for them at the beginning of the block, once Kaya shows up, that's it for the Ghost Council and the Guild's ghost stocks. Kaya taking the place of Guild Leader marks at least a partial victory for Teysa Karlov in her preceding clash for control with her grandfather and the rest of the Ghost Council, but Teysa would likely be much better in Kaya's new role, at least from an Orzhov perspective. The context to Kaya's actions offered by the Gathering Storm provides a far different perception of the events than players likely got from the cards. Kaya's self-satisfied expression on her Guild Leader card made her role within the guild seem much more intentional on her part than how it played out in the story. Kaya unknowingly falling into the position and the reluctance and distaste the guild evokes in her make everything make a lot more sense. Once Kaya has become the new leader, she can feel the magical, intangible chains of obligation binding her to her guild members and debtors and vice versa. An invisible but very real network that she sits at the center of, comprising all of the guild's financial ties. She can even release each chain individually, at the cost of a little physical pain, severing that person or lineage's connection to the Orzhov and voiding their debts. As more and more of the Syndicate's victims approach Kaya for absolution, she increasingly finds herself severing these chains. I will not live much longer, Guildmaster. I feel it in my bones. My only desire is that this burden that has crushed out my life not be passed on to my children. Your children inherit the debt? Kaya said. Yes, Guildmaster. Such is the law. Kaya shook her head. Your debt is forgiven. Run along. Thank you, Guildmaster, he said, his voice cracking. Thank you. My children. It's alright, Kaya said, seeing Taser approaching. Just, don't do it again. And continue to worship on whatever day it is you're supposed to. Unlike the story Spotlight, there is no singular moment of mass ghost absolution in the book, and I suppose the card more collectively represents Kaya's individual debt forgivings. Regardless, Kaya's altruism eventually puts her at odds with Taser. The remaining head of the Karlov line has at least appeared to be on Kaya's side through the novel's events, but once she sees how many of the Syndicate's assets are being discarded, Taser's concern aligns her with the other disgruntled Orzhov oligarchs. Her patience has dried up with Kaya's usefulness, and Taser's goons attempt to arrest Kaya so the guild can extract the Guildmaster magic from her, her safety in the event seemingly uncertain at best. Thanks to the aforementioned help of Ral and his boyfriend, Kaya escapes Taser's clutches, then soon after returns to the Orzhov Guildhall to exert her control. You don't have a choice, said a bearded man in the front row. You will do as we command, or you will die, and we will have a proper guildmaster. You are Benetov Graka, aren't you? Kaya said. She closed her eyes and reached for the massive contracts that weighed her down, the chains wrapped around her soul. One of them led to Graka, and it only took a moment to sort it out from the others. It was thick and heavy. I am, Graka said, and my family has served the Orzhov for thousands of years. An outsider like Benetov Graka, Kaya said thoughtfully, son of Orzhov Graka, who, in a moment of financial embarrassment, was forced to ask Patriarch Karlov for assistance. Which he provided, of course, as a good friend would. Except the understanding was that the Graka family would support the Karlovs whenever required. You are not a Karlov, Graka said. He'd gone several shades paler. I am the heir to Patriarch Karlov, the inheritor of all his contracts and obligations. Kaya smiled wider and gave the chain that connected them a short, sharp tug. And you are in breach. Graka gasped and sank to his knees. All of the remaining hierarchs are in debt to the Karlovs and therefore must answer to Kaya. Save for Taser, whom Kaya immediately arrests. Gently, at least, as she'd promised to Tomik. With Taser right back in jail and all the other oligarchs bound to her, no one else within the guild has the power to challenge Kaya. She grinned like a shark. So let's make a deal. The deal that's struck isn't specified, but perhaps it involved the mass absolution. As right before she exerted her control, Kaya decided to remain on Ravnica and use her position to help those the guild was harming. Although if that is the case, Taser's in that card art and she should be in jail. I really enjoy Kaya's characterization in The Gathering Storm, and her reluctantly deepening involvement and disgust with the Orzhov. It's very satisfying to see the masters of exploitation have their own system turned against them. And the moment depicted on her card in Allegiance works so much better for me now than the vague impression of her motivations that the card gave without context.
And seeing the church's inner workings through Kaya's point of view is elucidating to the nature of the Orzhov system of oppression that affects so many guildless lives.
Obviously, Kaya's usurpation of the guild is bloody great for the guildless. The debtors we see her release are always poor, destitute, and under the church's thumb. With someone like Kaya in charge, with motives opposing the syndicate's typical goals, the oppression of the Orzhov is being countered right at the top of their structure. As their exploitation is hampered and their new leader divides them internally, there's likely no other period of Ravnican history wherein the Syndicate have so many barriers between them and the people they so dearly wish to oppress. The Azorius are cracking down on them from the outside, and Kaya's doing so from within. Their exploitation may have gotten more exploitative as it's pushed further underground, but they have less opportunity to do it than ever. And I'm not sure that works. Obviously, it's fantastic for the fictional underclass, but the Orzhov's internal struggles do serve to make them less imposing this time around. Now that they're actually facing some kind of comeuppance, They don't cast quite such a long shadow over the plane. With their edges shaved off, they're just not as awesome as before. You can still find examples of their oppressive deeds.
By design, the sarcophagus muffles the debtors' moans, but does not silence them. But even on the cards,
The guild is running from itself. Orzhov vampires look for allies in unlikely places, in case their new guildmaster turns on them. The fate of the Obzedat is proof of Kaya's power and her hatred of the living dead. The Orzhov are victims of the larger plot this time around. Kaya's coup and the following internal conflict work great as part of the larger narrative, especially now that it's all been filled in, but they also can't help but damage the guild thematically. The Orzhov are great because they're the worst of the worst. An exaggeration of all the worst aspects of abusive institutions and systematic exploitation. With someone at the top who is not doing that, they're just not as good at being that delightfully awful caricature and just aren't as fun to think about. Or get behind if you're playing Orzhov and want some villain roleplay with your MTG, or MTG-themed roleplay. I'll circle back to this next video, but by the end of this block, war included, this is essentially the state the guild is still in, with a leader that is far too pure for them. And by the time we see the Orzhov next, I really hope this changes. I don't want Tomek to die, by the way. I'm trying to be clear. If we can somehow not kill Tomek and have him removed as guild leader, that would be great. Please.
House Demir.
Whilst Dovin's eyes scour the 10th in broad daylight, House Demir's still watch from the shadows. The unseen house is operating as we might imagine, and unlike some of their contemporaries, haven't undergone any particularly big shifts. They're still spying, stealing, and assassinating, they still want to know every shred of available knowledge in Ravnica, and they still mask the true nature of their guild with a friendly public face. The overt layer of the guild that the people of Ravnica see during their day-to-day is detailed more in this trip to Ravnica than in the previous ones. The couriers, investigators, media reporters, and archivists of the public-facing Demir represent how the majority of the city knows the guild. Members at the overt level provide legitimate services whilst dissuading all those vicious rumors and conspiracies about their guild. As to the uninformed face of the Demir, that's all they are. In this way, the overt members serve multiple functions to the house, providing street-level eyes and ears all across the city, while spreading disinformation to obscure the network of spies, thieves, and assassins that operates just below the legitimate surface. Lazav, their shape-shifting leader, who first showed up last block, has refused ousting by any new extraplanar upstarts, and he's back to cackle from the shadows. People would sooner savor sweet lies than chew plain truths. Lazav. Lazav is just as megalomaniacal as he was before, and he'd still like to see him and his guild holding dominion over the rest, but he's also not an idiot, and he knows when he's beaten. As evil and schemy as he is, Nicol Bolas is eviler and schemier. If the Elder Dragon comes to town, he's gonna enact his own plane-conquering plan and tread all over the Demir Guild leader's toes, and the man who can play any role will not be upstaged. Throughout the lead-up to the dragon's arrival, Lazav directs the efforts of his guild towards defending against that arrival. In the Gathering Storm, Lazav is a surprisingly trustworthy ally to Ral and the Anti-Bolas Alliance, scouring his own guild of traitors, providing Ral reliable information, and attending the guild summit himself. Probably, whilst wearing a cloak that's described exactly like those suits in A Scanner Darkly. Lazav even agrees to align the Demir with Ral's plan. Last block, Lazav was trying to kill all the guilds, and he may have ties to the original Demir leader, who wanted to stab the guild pack to death. But here, Lazav has his priorities in order, and he knows he'd have a much harder time wresting control of Ravnica away from the dragon than from the other guilds. So for now, the Demir are helping out. The Unseen House always seems to be in the middle of planning around a big coup, and whilst they're actually trying to prevent one this time, what a twist, the Guildless still fall beneath the Demir's consideration. The city's commoners may be led astray from the truth by the Demir's increasing disinformation campaign, but the true purpose of that is to flood the channels of the newly active Azorius, and obscuring the truth from Dovin can only be beneficial in the long run. Just like last time, we can find individual examples of the Guildless being harmed, but the Demir are pretty clean when it comes to systemic oppression. Instead, what the Guildless are to the Demir is a veil. The short story connected to the Demir this block shows us a low-level spy, a Guildless dock worker with very little knowledge of the Demir, or even the purpose of the info he's required to acquire. All levels of Dimir hierarchy have extreme degrees of information separation, wherein all knowledge of the Dimir's activities is strictly need to know. But the story showed us that perhaps there isn't much separation between the Guildless and the bottom tier of Dimir agents. The Dimir hide amongst the Guildless and recruit from them due to skill or more likely circumstance, with varying degrees of temporality. Both the D&D and art books detail various locations around the city and their guild affiliations, as well as the semi-clandestine upmarket district for the Dimir's inner circle. They note how the house utilizes locations where the gilded and the not intersect. Bane Alley, where that broker from the previous block resides, is a place where more than just market goods can be bought. If the right questions are asked and the right price is paid, any problem can be solved, provided that problem wants stealing, snooping, or stabbing. Though clients have little knowledge of who they're really dealing with, and little memory of the deal after the fact. The Ismeri Library is open to all citizens, and is officially ungilded, though it's run by members of the Dimir, and is something of a stronghold to the house. Whilst other guilds suspect that there's more going on there, the Dimir frequently use the library to pass information to each other, all the while nestled amongst the public. The house's desire to blend in with the Guildless is reflected in their character designs, which get a little better every time. Originally, the Dimir were far too bony and spiky to be effectively convincing sneaks, but thankfully this element of them has dampened over the years, and they've become a lot more believable. By the third block, a lot of elements of their designs are lifted straight from the Guildless style guide pages. Big lapels, anyone? And they have the most muted aesthetic of any guild. That said, they're still too over-designed, and as muted and plausible as their outfits have become, you can still pick Dimir agents out of a crowd in a heartbeat. And if I can do that, then so can the Boros and the Azorius. They're too uniform and they're recognizable still, which is the last thing they should be. It feels like for every time we've seen the house, Watsy put all this effort towards the question of how to design the Dimir, when the real answer is just to not do that. I don't think the Dimir should even have a style guide section, or at least not a full one. The guild would look so much better and really live up to that guild that doesn't exist moniker if they didn't have a recognizable style of their own and all just appeared guildless, with the variety that the guildless have. The house already has this nice rule of three identifier thing going on that you can see in their weapons and armor and crime scenes. And leaning further into that as their primary visual qualifier would have been much better than essentially creating a standardized Dimir uniform from guildless clothes, as it feels was done for this blog. Picking Dimir agents out from the ungilded they hide amongst by the splashes of their guild colors and the subtly tripled elements of their costuming would be a lot more fun and believable than wondering how anyone in Ravnica is fooled by the Assassin's Creed cosplayers the guild currently employs. I should be able to focus on bystanders in backgrounds and wonder if the 3 bands on that guy's arm and his blue scarf mark him as Dimir, or whether I'm just paranoid. The Dimir never quite do it for me visually, but when it comes to Lazav, I can respect a villain that respects an even greater one. And in a time where guild politics are more malleable and fickle than ever, I'm not saying fickler, fickler sounds stupid. Shut up, Microsoft Word. The Dimir know where they stand, and they know how to prioritize. By aligning themselves against the dragon, at least for this brief period, the house and the people are on the same side. The Izzet League. Look out! It's some sort of terrorist attack / natural disaster. Don't worry, actually, it's just the Izzet League. It's progress that knocked that tower block down. As we already know, the Izzet have had their leader replaced by a planeswalking upstart, but he's one of the nice ones, so it's fine. In response to the heated climate, the Guild of Mad Sciences has been clamping down on info escaping their facilities, whilst increasing the development and production of weapons. Super weapons, even. There's a minor clash with how the Guild are presented in the Gathering Storm and outside of it. Where outside the Gathering Storm, the production of these weapons is focused on a lot. They even developed some with the Boros. But in the Gathering Storm, obviously they were doing Ral's plan. But perhaps some of the weapons were ones that Niv Mizzet utilized during his duel with Nicol Bolas. Though once Niv has given Ral control of the Izzet, the novel notes how the Storm Mage gets the entire guild working on the Living Guild Pact plan. And the flavor text for their Guildgate, the showy one, kind of unifies the cards and the book presentation a little. Every laboratory buzzes with new experiments, each a piece of Ral's ambitious project. So even if this, and this, and this, and this, and this doesn't look like it would contribute to Ral's maze-adjusting, node-constructing, it all actually was, and the whole league did work together on the plan. And it's an unprecedented level of cooperation and focus from the guild, which more often operates as a series of minor, ego-driven personality cults, with multiple attendants helping to realize the explosive fantasies of the chemister in charge of each lab. But in the Gathering Storm, and with time very short, the League is an extension of Ral and Niv's plan. And it is a bit inconsistent with how the Guild are shown elsewhere, both during the block and before. It's noted in the novel how it is unusual that their typical scientific approach of just fuck around and find out has been replaced by a need to diligently follow Ral's predefined specifications, but they seem to handle it pretty well. The only real scientific mishaps that happen, again, a thing the Guild often just works towards but are now avoiding at all costs, occur thanks to Dovin's betrayal, and the Izzet are on point throughout. The engineers Ral installed in the Azorius Guild Hall did take some time to prank the Grand Arbiter when they first arrived, but they did their jobs nonetheless. So like the Orzhov, the Izzet are victims of the larger plot a little bit, but not to the same degree, and it doesn't bother me as much. An Izzet that briefly comes together so they can explode stuff better later is more fun to get behind than an Orzhov that can't back up its threats. Regardless of their brief period of focus, wreckage still follows in the Izzet's wake, and the cards are full of examples of their civic destruction. The Izzet are blamed for every little disaster, which is unfair because we only cause most of them. Mizzix of the Iz Magnus. When they're not unitedly reconstructing the implicit maze, the Guild are doing what they usually do, while the city pays the cost. And often the city paying the cost is part of the desired outcome. Ravnica's premier civic engineers are still more concerned with jetpacks and lightning than with stable infrastructure. They're even using the infrastructure they've already installed under the 10th to conduct grand experiments with Izzet-themed outcomes for the denizens unlucky enough to be living above them. In the Gathering Storm, whilst Ral's plan seemingly isn't responsible for much Izzet-themed destruction, during Niv Mizzet's duel with Bolus, the Firemind does cause a lot of collateral damage to the city, and even intentionally destroys part of it to drop on the invader. The book specifies how this is very much an occupied area, too. But of course, what's coming will be so much worse, so at least for this period, perhaps the collateral damage is a little bit more forgivable than it usually is. To get a pass when it comes to the Guildless this block is definitely easier than in the other ones. All you really have to do is not be on the side that's trying to get an evil dictator into power. And due to Ral and Niv, the Izzet led the biggest counterattack that Ravnica had to offer the Dragon Planeswalker. The League are historically unconcerned with the damage they wreak, and that's absolutely still true, and something the city should go right back to taking umbrage with as soon as a smidge of normalcy returns. But in Guilds of Ravnica, the Izzet showed that they can even fight their own nature, lean into Blue's desire for perfection, and actually focus every now and then. When it came down to the wire, the Izzet proved that they can see the bigger picture and put all their efforts towards saving the city. The Cult of Rakdos. With all the building tension, the people of Ravnica are feeling the constraint of their entrenched political net, and the Cult of Rakdos are still here, pointing out just how dumb it all is. Rakdos return, leaning more into their carnival aesthetic than ever before, whilst their exploits remain as whimsical as they are murderous. The cult still follows the demon whose name they bear, and they still want to spread their infectious carnage as far as they can, but they're making a more enticing spectacle of it than they previously did. If only the rest of Ravnica could see the majesty in a fleeting life lived to fulfillment, and the hilarity of the doldrum they all inhabit instead. The Azorius' crackdown on the city has obviously not favoured the demon worshippers particularly well, and many of the Rakdos' clubs and rings where the guild peddled their dark entertainment have been shut down, the number of Rakdos establishments dwindling to a few. In response, the cult has taken to the streets, transforming their already incredibly loose structure into a series of travelling performing troops. Rakdos performances play out across the pathways of the 10th, day and night, ranging in spectacle, scale, and violence. Jesters and acrobats do unspeakable things with chains, fire, and audience members, all from atop entire stages held aloft by giants. Mostly the pageantry and satire of the Rakdos shows are the point in of themselves, but often they mask darker schemes, such as the assassination of the hapless audience volunteer, seemingly chosen at random. The cult is even more driven by personality than the Izzet, and renown is just about the only thing resembling hierarchy within the guild. Rakdos performers live to do just that, and for the grandest of performances, they might even stop with the living part. And the grandest of performances are the only type that'll get you into Rix Mardi and in front of the Demon Paran himself. Performing for Rakdos is the greatest of honors, though jaded as he is, the demon is perhaps the harshest critic a cultist can face, and performers who really piss him off might even get dragged away down the dark corridor that leads to the Jester's crypt. the one place in Rixmadi where there is no fun. Very few have ever returned from the crypt, and almost no one knows what truly happens to those who offend the ancient demon. The guild's aesthetic is more focused than ever, and almost every card references their status as entertainers. And with the redesign they've received for this block, the Rakdos have become one of the best looking guilds in Ravnica. As opposed to the style guide last block, which stressed that carnival elements be used in moderation, here the circus is evoked throughout their designs. Taking a heavier influence from real-world circus performers, the Rakdos are demonic jesters through and through, with curled black wrought iron elements atop elegant but sleek Harlequin outfits. I appreciated the increased realism in the cult's presentation last block, and that's even more true now. Cards like Wrath the Demon, Light Up the Stage, and Footlight Fiend show us the inner workings of a Rakdos performance, and how the cult's smaller demons contribute to the show. This footlight's broken. Get me a stagehand. Cult Guild Mage gives us a fun example of how the Rakdos can appeal to the city's sense of humor, and Captive Audience shows us just that, as people from all walks in Ravnica, gilded and not, are drawn in by the carnage, unable to look away. The short story connected to the cult did a good job creating a believably Rakdos social climate between its members. It follows a washed-up demon performer who's trying to woo the owner of a local magical effigy shop. He needs to work up the courage to talk to her, even though the pair have already met at several orgies. I stammer. You and me, we... Ah, the beast with two backs, she exclaims. But those were parties, and that was different, and everything's more complicated in the daylight. Previously, the wanton destruction of their antics was more in focus, and the cult was shown to prey on the weak. And this isn't absent in Guild's blog. There are still examples of unfortunate folk in guildless garb about to meet darkly comic ends, but now the powerful are the main targets of the cult's violent lampoonery. Ridicule the powerful, empower the ridiculous. Judith, the Scourge Diva. Rakdos' chaotic ideology is most opposed to those who seek to install order, and as the cult is further marginalized, Ravnica's authority figures increasingly find themselves the subjects of ridicule and funny murder. The cult is still no true friend to the commoners of Ravnica. They've got a lot of violent nutjobs amongst their ranks, and on the best of days, at least a few innocent bystanders will get maimed, burned, or pulled into a violent frenzy with magic. But now the Guildless and the Rakdos share the same enemy: the encroaching authorities and Dragon. As I noted in the rundown, Rakdos himself is surprisingly helpful with the plan against Bolas, and his representative even more so. In Guilds of Ravnica block, the Rakdos focused their antics just a touch, recognized the true threats to their way of life, and acted accordingly, redefining themselves into something even truer to their original entertaining purpose and aligning their perspective with the city's downtrodden, laughing all the while.
The Golgari swarm.
As the world above tears itself apart, the Undercity dwellers believe their time is nigh. The Golgari still rule the majority of the Undercity and, through their constant use of necromancy, remain one of the largest guilds on the plane. The Swarm still believe firmly in the cycle of life and death, and spend most of their time recycling, in one way or another. The city's waste still flows down to them, and they're still using it to propagate the decay-fueled life, etc. they value so dearly. As we know, the Gorgon Planeswalker Vraska has been installed as guild leader by the approaching dragon, and Vraska made some dramatic changes as soon as she was in power. With the help of the recently uncovered erstwhile, Vraska deposed the ruling elf Jared, but also the ruling class of elves, the Devkarin, who'd held control of the Golgari for decades. The Devkarin are still around, if a little bitter, though some races that were previously considered lesser by the elves have taken on much more prominent roles in the guild. Gorgons, who used to hold little reputation beyond fear within the guild, have been elevated by the new leader. But most notably, the insectile Crowl have gone from the Swarm's margins to taking places in Vraska's court. As much as it helps the dragon, Vraska taking power does aid some of the downtrodden within the guild. Bolas demonstrated to Vraska that he holds the reins of the erstwhile, and would decimate the guild if she betrayed him. And the reluctant Vraska carries out his orders despite the bleak future she predicts under the dragon's reign. After seeing her evolve in the Ixalan story, it's delightfully painful to see Vraska resenting her own character development, as she's forced to act against her wishes under the dragon's thumb. At least if I'd forgotten all of it, I might have had a chance at being happy in his service. As he isolates Vraska from her former allies, Bolas is also isolating the Golgari from the other guilds. Starting at some point before the Gorgons rise to power, the Golgari have been sealing entrances to the Undercity, shutting themselves away from the surface. Shut the gates. In the Underrealm, we will outlast the coming doom. Vraska. The art and D&D books both note how the Golgari spread spores and worse up through areas that have been recently abandoned, making them unlivable to surface dwellers. Golgari Raiders flavor even describes some of these expansions as brazen topside sorties, so perhaps not everywhere the swarm is infesting was abandoned after all. With the dragons pushing, the guild has started to see themselves as the coming rulers of the plane. When the fragile systems of the surface fail, the Golgari will be there to repurpose their remains. The new chip on the shoulder of the Underdwellers is reflected in their new costumes. Recycled elements like bones, insect chitin, and fungus still bedeck the swarm as they have before, but now they've been arranged along graceful gowns and elegant courtly attire. Almost gone is the outcast vibe from before, replaced by that of a mysterious and magical underground kingdom, with bioluminescent fungi adding to its majesty. They're no longer exiles from the surface, they're the elite of what's under it. Whilst the swarm seem to be exhibiting more confidence in themselves than before, this newfound confidence comes at the cost of their relationship to the rest of the city. It really isn't mentioned much in the text related to the Golgari this block, but the D&D book does note that they are still providing free food. Gruel, apparently, to anyone in the city that needs it. So the guild apparently do still offer the Guildless the same important service they always have, but it seems almost antithetical to everything else they're doing. A holdover from a time when they saw themselves as part of the system instead of as its successor.
Shut the Gates is about as far from you are welcome in the swarm as you can get, and the change in their guild gates flavor text perfectly illustrates the change in the Golgari's relationship to the Guildless since last block. They may have still been handing out free gruel through their lockdown, but any kinship any maligned overworld Guildless may have had with the Golgari has been severed. Quite literally. With gates.
Whilst their reluctant leader may have a clearer idea of what will truly happen to Ravnica in the near future, the swarm is still happy to chase a dream that sees them at the top of the city. The long-standing malignment and oppression the guild have faced from the others has left them distanced and happy to embrace political upheaval to a system that places them at the bottom. But in viewing themselves as the victims, the Golgari have forgotten, or don't care, that their actions have victims as well. By elevating themselves in their own estimation and turning their backs entirely to the surface, the Golgari have rejected everyone, including the loners and outcasts that used to add to their ranks. The swarm is no longer the last refuge of the downtrodden, but just another set of elitists with different standards. The Gruel clans. As it turns out, civilization on Ravnica is still here, so the Gruel clans still got a problem with that. The guild that isn't are still camping in the ruins of the society they gradually destroy, grumbling about returning the city to nature when they aren't roaring about it and smashing it down. Most maligned amongst all the guilds, the former protectors of Ravnica's wilds have long since been ousted from their official position and rage at the society that ignored and rejected them. There's more information on the Gruel's history this block, and the art book notes how the shamans and druids of the ancient Gruel celebrated the wilds but were made obsolete by the other green guilds. When the last towering druid tree fell, and the last sacred grove was dug out for a stone quarry, the spark of rage that still burns in every Gruel heart was kindled. That rage is one of the qualities that all Gruel clans share. 7 different clans, some of which we've seen before, are big enough to get names this block. And they all exhibit different traits and approaches and follow differing sets of beliefs, whilst all still sharing the desire to violently return the world to nature. Rage runs throughout them all, and it's shown more in this block to be a magical force, uniting and invigorating the Gruel as it courses through them. An ancient fury at the world's architectural burial. Rage spreads from one warrior to another like fire, as it alights their tattoos and is channeled into shamanic spells and violent action. The Gruel pick up more depth with each set they're in, and their new style guide section gives them a more punk-inspired look to reflect their rebel nature. Across the several clans we hear about, we see that certain clans prefer a subtler, more ranged approach to violence, while others set up where the fighting is thickest. One clan heavily modifies their bodies with scars and tattoos to represent the areas of the city they've destroyed, while another venerates the old ways of the ancient Gruel, and believe that the vast structural desecration of their plane will all come crashing down. When the end raise is upon us, and the hooves of the great Ilhag the Raise-Boar beat the civilized world to dust. As the long-standing leader of the Gruel's largest clan is deposed, many believe that the end raise is closer than ever. Domri Raid appeared in a short story last block, where his spark ignited during his live burial-based initiation into the clan. The D&D book specifies that this live burial initiation, symbolizing a birth into a new life, is common amongst Gruul clans, and magic is provided to help survive it. But it wasn't enough to protect the teenage boy's mind, and the trauma transported him away to a vast jungle in jungly Naya, on the plain of Alara. When Domri opened his eyes on that strange world, he saw the dream of the Gruul fulfilled. Wild, untamed nature in all directions, with Neria building in sight. And he could have spent the rest of his life there, or exploring an infinite number of lush worlds. But instead he came right back to help his guild because he wanted to fulfill that dream for his friends and his home. So as much as the young mage, now a little older, is a pawn of the coming dragon, his intentions are purely Gruul. Domri sees the city as the enemy, and Bolus is the enemy of that enemy. Bolus doesn't share the Gruul's desires, but I doubt that was part of his pitch to them, and the clans are a useful tool. Domri may be small, but his connection to the wilds and his passion are enough to unite the clans like never before. The specifics of Bolus's help with Domri's ascent to the top of the clans aren't detailed anywhere, but the young Gruul has the ability to command herds of wild beasts to fight on his behalf. It is irritating that most of the Gruul's antics during this block are missing from the Gathering Storm, though. We only hear about Domri's duel with the Cyclops, and the rampage of the clans that Domri leads later on to further damage and stir up the guilds isn't depicted either. Regardless, we know their actions don't have the city's best interests at heart. They're the Gruul! And a Gruul that's more united than ever may be great for them if they don't think too hard about what they're enabling. But it's even worse than regular for a Ravnica that would rather not get attacked by any Gruul cheers, let alone all of them. The innocuous ranking that I don't put a number to when evaluating how the guilds treat the not guilds doesn't change a lot between blocks when it comes to the Gruul. They just get a little bit better presented and a little bit worse for the city.
The Rubble Belt, the collective name of the Gruul turf that surrounds and permeates the central city, has seemingly only grown in size, to the point where the art of Ravnica refers to rubble belts in the plural.
The Guildless still make up at least almost half the population, so when the Gruul come a-smashing, they're still likely the biggest chunk of the victims. And now the clans are smashing stuff with even more gusto than before, on behalf of a dragon who shares none of their beliefs and certainly won't give them what they want. There's nothing to be said. The Guildless live in the city, the Gruul smash the city. The Boros Legion. Whilst the guilds have all returned mostly as we remember them, it's their relationships to the Guildless that are most divergent in Guilds block. And the Boros are here to hammer or punch that point home even better than the Golgari did. The Boros Legion is still potentially the strongest military on Ravnica, and they still work constantly to bring their brand of justice to the city. Aurelia, the angelic war leader who took control of the guild before the last block, is still in charge, and her loyalties lie with the city and not with mean old Mr. Bolus. Aurelia was characterized last time as far more involved than the Boros' founder and previous leader, and she's leaned further into that characterization as she restructures the Legion to better serve the city and her beliefs. Previously, Aurelia had the Boros organized into 4 theaters, each dealing with specific threats to Ravnica or needs of the Legion. But in the current climate, the theaters have been dissolved, and their responsibilities shared across the Legion, as it's overhauled again into a multitude of small garrisons dotting the city. This serves the Legion from 2 angles, as the Boros can address the city's problems at a much more local, individualized level, whilst also using the decentralization to create intel separation between the garrisons. In the current Cold War, the Legion is as afraid of spies and traitors as the rest of the guilds, and the little information that is passed between the separately operating Boros bases is carried by their angels, whom the Legion believe to be incorruptible. Wojek used to describe the Boros police, but now the word is associated with the elite soldiers of the Legion, the only group unaffiliated with individual garrisons and given increased freedom, whilst the garrisons provide police and militia at the local level. I said in the last Guildless video that I wasn't sure that Aurelia was the one good cop who would change the system, but maybe she is. Last block, the Angel was responsible for shifting the focus of the Legion into helping the downtrodden. But much like the original block, there were still examples of the Boros causing the Guildless harm. And Aurelia had at least a bit of Borosy bloodlust in her presentation. According to the art book, Aurelia has softened even further due to her interactions with the heroic planeswalker, Gideon. I guess that exchange on Renounce the Guilds that didn't have context did actually happen, and Aurelia has made protecting the weak a core part of her guild's mission statement. Those who show no mercy to the weak deserve no mercy from the strong. Justice is the driving principle of this iteration of the Legion, and Aurelia has recognized the ordinary, namely Guildless, people of the plane caught between the clashes of the guilds as the most deserving of the protection of the Boros' righteous hand. To Aurelia, true justice doesn't mean following the letter of the law, but the establishment of fair, equitable, and compassionate relationships among all of Ravnica's people. She actively works to improve relationships between guilds, protects the weak from their conflicts and machinations, and works to ensure that the law's enforcement not encroach on the freedoms of the people. And Aurelia's approach seems to be affecting the whole guild. In the previous blocks, it wasn't hard to find examples of the Boros' hastily applied violence harming the common folk, but that just isn't here anymore. They aren't angry cops in the stories, and they aren't angry cops on the cards. And you could argue that this is another example of a guild being warped to fit the narrative, as the Boros lose their harmful edge in favor of being positioned as heroes for what's coming. But for me, the Legion's shifted presentation works excellently. Ravnica's police have all collectively agreed to play good cop bad cop 24/7 in this block, and without the Azorius there playing the bad role better than ever, the Boros' new heroism might feel like a watering down of Ravnica. But positioned against the Azorius, re-represented as a response to the Senate's heartless overreach, the Boros feel more white-red, more Boros than ever. Here, their red fuels not zeal, but compassion for the community that white values. A compassion that recognizes those harmed most by the system the Legion upholds, and cannot abide by the inhumanity of the big brother state that Dovin desires. The Azorius are still here to demonstrate how the enforcement of Ravnica's legal system causes harm to the undeserving. But now the group previously responsible for perhaps the largest chunk of that harm are the only ones identifying it as a problem. Even including the Underdwellers, the Boros have had the biggest shift in their relationship to the Guildless of any guild. But the change feels natural, gradually shifting across the 3 blocks under Aurelia's influence. The Angel Guild Leader is the real deal and one of the most outright heroic characters we have in Guild's block. Focusing her guild towards the betterment of the city, assisting in the plan against Bolus multiple times, and just being cool as fuck.
I had my differences with Asperia, Aurelia said. I cannot deny it, but I also cannot deny her commitment to the common good, to the defense of Ravnica, in spite of any philosophical arguments that might have divided us. She trusted you, and invited you to our meeting in good faith. You turned that trust against her. The angel leveled her blade at Vraska. For that, I cannot forgive you.
Aurelia is the most justice-driven person on Ravnica, and under her, the Boros Legion serve the common folk of the plane better than any iteration we've seen before. They are still the state-sanctioned enforcers of the plane, and being as large as they are in a city as dangerous as Ravnica, instances of harm would be unavoidable. But the examples of that harm just don't exist, and with the state fractured, the Boros have prioritized Ravnica's people over its systems, and they're the only guild with protecting the Guildless listed in their goals.
The Selesnya Conclave.
Maintaining at least the appearance of stability from within their peaceful green spaces whilst the rest of Ravnica rounds on itself, Selesnya are doing what they usually do: gardening. Still the largest cultivators of ordered natural spaces on Ravnica, Selesnya have undergone no huge transformation. Visually and ideologically, they follow from their previous iteration. An organized religion of nature worshippers, life, order, and harmony are the guild's core tenets. And the names of the 3 dryads who mashed themselves together into the supposedly earth god channeling guild leader, Trostani, during the last block. But we find them now more divided than ever. Trostani usually acts as a single being, but lately the 3 dryads are discordant. Order wishes to establish better relationships with the other guilds, to ease the tension and build community. Whereas Life wishes to militarize further and strengthen the Conclave against future conflict. Harmony has fallen silent whilst the other 2 disagree, and Trostani is essentially paralyzed, fading out of relevance whilst the guild carries on around them. I like the imagery and the idea of Trostani's discordance, and as much as they don't feature in the stories, the division still serves the plot. But it is another example of a guild being warped into a state that's a bit less true to their themes. Selesnya but internally divided is a Selesnya that's less Selesnyan.
And if you bought the Selesnya guild kit, then instead of a Trostani, Selesnya's voice who unitedly leads your token army, you were stuck with one where they're all dejected and sad. I love when my commander looks like it's about to give up.
Imara Tandis, the elf lady that Jace had a bit of a thing for in the previous block, has become the guild's temporary leader, if not in title. After ousting the Bolus-controlled, militarization-focused Glademaster Garrow from leading Selesnya early in the Gathering Storm, Imara accepted the role thrust upon her and seems to be striking a good balance when it comes to the current communal/military desires of the guild's discordant leader. Imara's history as a diplomat and guild representative during the Secretist makes her a great fit for strengthening inter-guild relationships, and Imara attended the summit herself. But we can see from the cards that she's not dampened Selesnya's power consolidation either.
Our forces number more than the leaves of Vitu Ghazi.
Do not provoke us. Selesnya's nature hippies angle is still at the forefront, but they get a little bit spikier in their presentation each time we see them. Fernardi's shieldmate wants to show us Selesnyan soil up close,
And in Conclave Tribunal, Seb McKinnon shows us how Selesnya can appear to those their empathy doesn't extend to.
that token is threatening, and the Conclave seem like they've loosened the leash a bit too much when it comes to their wild animals. Selesnya grows its ranks in more ways than one. As to why they've made a leashless, bust-sized wolf and set it loose on the Guildless, who knows? Although the market folk of Siege Worm wish their biggest problem was a bust-sized wolf. Suddenly, all the haggling didn't seem so important. The Conclave has always had a thing for giant worms, which they deploy and ride around on. And in a world covered in city, can you think of anything worse? The Selesnyan short makes it clear that worms don't leave tunnels behind them when burrowing through the earth. Is it burrowing if it's a worm? Is that what worms do? I don't know. Whatever. The worm equivalent of burrowing.
You do call what worms do burrowing. I don't know why I lost my mind for a minute there.
They briefly liquidize whatever's in front of them with sonic magic before swimming through it, leaving the earth intact behind them. So at the very least, they're not destroying the foundations of the city, and I guess someone has to tame the worms if there are worms. But it definitely seems like they could use a better degree of control over them, and the Conclave are cultivating them too. You shouldn't... Stop this, Selesnya. At least until they accidentally breed a worm that swallows the world, Selesnya is still a force for good in Ravnica. They've remained true to their natural communal values and resisted the lure of the dragon. While some of their recent endeavors have accrued more Guildless-shaped collateral than usual, they remain one of the guilds most likely to directly care about and help the Guildless through the charity and community they cultivate across Ravnica. Even without their leader, Selesnya proved the strength of that community and remained true to their values. The Simic Combine. Oh no, I've run out of funny or interesting intros. The Simic are back also, as well. The Guild of Mad Biomancers are still making sure that they and any wild animals nearby have enough claws, fins, wings, tentacles, air sacs, teeth, and eyes. The secret underground merfolk rose from the secret underground oceans last block to become the backbone of the Simic, and the structure of the guild is mostly the same. Primarily, they operate out of their dotted entrances to the deep, the Zonots. There's a minor inconsistency in the art book that states that the remains of the Simic swam down into the newly opened Zonots to meet the merfolk, whereas in her public address, Zagana said that the risen merfolk sought out the Simic's remnants. Perhaps both are true for different Zonots. Regardless, the new Simic still stand by their twinned yet counter principles of holdfast, conservation, and upwelling. Progress. But where before the balance of the two was valued, now the clashing ideals spread division through the guild. The Utopians believe in slow growth that's harmonious with the world's ecosystem, whereas the Adaptationists believe Ravnica's ecosystem to be fickle and fragile and something to be outpaced. Both factions hold by their own interpretations of the holdfast and upwelling, but each is more aligned with one. Zagana, the utopian merfolk who led the guild last block, has been deposed by the elf ooze Vanifar. The new prime speaker has brought her adaptationist views to the forefront of the guild. Havoc is a small price to pay for data. Under the newly active Vanifar, the Simic are making themselves deadlier than ever to fight whatever's coming down the food chain. Their efforts have been realigned into a series of short-term projects, mostly focused on defense. The Guardian Project is Vanifar's new super soldier program, where genetics are mashed to create very Simic-y soldiers. Always one of the most isolationist guilds, the Simic isolate themselves even further, moving as many operations as they can into subaquatic labs beneath the Zonots. The Simic view their work as above the petty politics of the guilds, and their response to the rising climate is to remove themselves and bunker down until it all blows over. Unlike the last block where it wasn't mentioned at all, the Flavorful Guide article does note how the Simic are still doing their job of maintaining Ravnica's public health. Hooray! They're doing it! Hooray! It's only a cursory mention though, and just like always, the Simic are shown to be biomancing instead of medicining. Maybe some of these pods are back to tank-esque healing dealies, but more often than not, they're just incubating monsters. And like Selesnya and themselves in the previous block, the Simic do have a penchant for unleashing their creations on the unsuspecting city. I might have overfed him. Gulliston, Simic Biomancer. The Combine's relationship to the Guildless hasn't changed much since last block, even as the Guild undergoes internal shifts. They're still expanding the food chain to a degree that is not welcome on the streets, but apparently they're at least now providing some healthcare somewhere to someone off camera. And in the Gathering Storm, the Simic were initially pretty resistant to Ral's plan, but they did agree to it later on. The Simic Combine may view the city as something to survive rather than contribute to, and they absolutely place themselves above everyone in it, but at least they didn't throw him with the dragon. So them's the guilds of Ravnica block. Largely similar in form and function to their previous iterations, but with shifting interpretations of their dualistic ideologies that, through their actions, ripple across the city and its people, as all the guilds change to meet the coming narrative conclusion. And even where some of the guilds have grown vastly inhuman in their actions, there is a thread of humanity that runs throughout them. Obviously, there are humans in every guild. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, over the years, the guild's presentation has tended towards relatability. In the original block, the zeal of the guild's ideological standpoints was at the forefront, and their expressions of them would often feel like fanaticism. Alongside the art direction tending towards realism over the years, the guild's presentation would more readily demonstrate the humanity of their members. Here there's fresh-faced Boros recruits and their seasoned instructors. Izzet mages cheering with the joy of epiphany. Golgari shamans carefully painting empathetically shifting mood marks. Dimir snitches rumorizing the streets, and Rakdos performers using conjured fireballs to apply lipstick. Even authority figures within the guilds feel more like actual people who have inherited or risen to their positions rather than caricatures of their color pairing's values, as they often did in the original block. The block's accompanying short stories by Nikki Drayden also lent to this down-to-earth perspective on the guilds, each story following a low-ranking member of a different guild, some even only loosely affiliated with said guild. And all of the stories add a ton of texture to the world of Ravnica. Nikki Drayden is really good at adding tons of fantastic world-building details. Vidalcan running baths with oils toxic to humans, merfolk muttering the disagreements they don't wish to be heard downstream, Gruul making tattoo ink from maca scat, Izzet mages calling in every favor to get their struggling new lab off the ground, Crowl intoning how much time other Crowl have spent living amongst elves by the way they use their wings when speaking Crowl. For many of the protagonists, their inclusion in the guild is more a matter of circumstance than their personal beliefs. The Dimir's guildless informant is desperately poor, and to him, the guild is little more than a revenue stream that's not particularly lucrative. The Orzhov tithe taker we follow was born into the guild, and the Crowl protagonist of the Golgari story wants to get a place in the guild working under a lich for the benefits it can offer him. Then, once inducted, sees how his elven peers are favored over him. Drayden does an excellent job adding depth to Ravnica with her grounded presentation. Her writing really makes Ravnica feel like a proper melting pot of varied cultures and races. That said, and whilst my perception of the stories is generally positive, I do think almost all of them had the same flaw, in that the plot would often weirdly, dramatically escalate in ways that didn't feel believable or squeezable into stories so short. And that didn't gel with the otherwise grounded tone. But overall, the stories still contributed to the humanizing of the guilds in Guilds of Ravnica block. They all felt like organizations made up of real people. Even while the machinations of the guild leaders loom over the city, underneath them are people just going about their days. So you must be feeling pretty full of context. We've looked at the story, we've looked at the guilds, and whilst we've kept the common folk in our hearts throughout, it's time to put them in front of our eyes. Why did I leave that in? The Guildless of Guilds of Ravnica block. The Ungilded of Ravnica are still here, as you might have guessed from the title of the video. We made it to the topic of the video. It's only been
95
minutes. Christ, I don't even want to know what time I'm going to superimpose there. I am going to die of editing. For both previous blocks, there was at least some text available on the internet addressing the Guildless directly. And whilst there wasn't a torrent of information provided, there is no equivalent text online for the Guildless this block. That said, the group is directly addressed perhaps more so than before in the art and D&D books. The D&D book particularly provides us some basic info on the Guildless and the people of Ravnica in general this block. About half of Ravnica's population is guildless, is a statement that's apparently still true, and the book notes that the ungilded are far more prevalent outside the plane's major urban centers, where the sets don't tend to focus. The racial makeup of the Guildless is also briefly commented on. Only a few races are mentioned, but Loxodons are uncommon amongst the Guildless, as their sense of community typically leads them to Selesnya. And there are only a handful of Guildless Loxodon cards. Nearly all elves are members of guilds according to the D&D book, though there have been plenty of Guildless elf cards over the years, this block included. And despite how prevalent goblins are in every red guild, they're apparently just prevalent in general, and a majority of goblins are guildless. This is reflected in the cards, and most goblins in Ravnica sets lack watermarks or other guild associations. Typically shunned by many of the MTG societies goblins find themselves in, on Ravnica, gangs of guildless goblins are very common. 2's a party, 3's a felony. Also noted about Ravnica's people in the Guildmaster's Guide is that the modern amenities of their comparatively advanced civilization are shared by the city's diverse peoples, who enjoy a life adorned by a variety of species, gender identities, and sexual orientations. Something you probably already assumed, but is nice to see in writing. Ral's relationship to Tomik was depicted in the book that was delayed, remember? And in the following set, that relationship was only hinted at, whilst another high-profile queer relationship that had been baited for years was cut off at the neck. Maybe to appease China? So given what would follow, it is nice to have some confirmation that the people of Ravnica's relationships to gender and sexuality can be as varied as in our own world. In other details we could have inferred about Ravnica, but the D&D book explicitly states, many different industries are run by the city's Ungilded. Baking, cartography, universities, guides, traders, bartenders, criminal gangs that rival the Orzhov, at least locally, are all listed by the book. Though the list is implied to be much longer and potentially encompass all professions that fall outside the wheelhouses of the guilds. The D&D book also gives us a good idea of the structure of the 10th district through its detailing of its 6 precincts. A few of the 10 guilds can be found in each precinct, their presence in the area often dictated by the organizations and real estate they control within. For example, 3 of the 4 red guilds' guild halls can be found in Precinct 4, and as a result, much of the precinct is in near constant conflict, as the Rakdos, Gruul, and Boros clash in the streets, and Izzet experiments shake the foundations, at least, of the cheap housing built near their facilities. The Guildmaster's Guide offers a general sense of the people and their lifestyles for each section of the 10th, and we can see that much like in our world, the areas that make up the central city of Ravnica are primarily divided by class. In Precinct 1, the area surrounding the Chamber of the Guild Pact, the grand architecture reflects the area's reputation as the heart of Ravnica's civilization, as well as the lifestyles of the wealthy and privileged who reside there. Moving down the ladder, the upper middle class Precinct 2 offers plentiful housing for the well-off working families and former and current Azorius members who live there in the shadow of the Azorius Guildhall. Precinct 3 offers a similar level of comfort, though the area surrounding the Selesnyan Guildhall is the greenest section of the 10th, and boasts agriculture that the other precincts can't. The tumult of Precinct 4 keeps its cost of living low, though the majority of its inhabitants are members of its local guilds or aspire to be. Precinct 5 is as blue as 4 is red, and Sonnet 7 can be found there, alongside a variety of educational institutions. Libraries, universities, and other specialist schools. The bulk of the precinct's residents are students in student housing or professors and researchers living more upmarket. Precinct 6 is the 10th's largest working class area. Much of the precinct is covered in warehouses, and the area also houses the smelting quarter, the heart of manufacturing industry in the 10th. The practical-minded residents of Precinct 6 are mainly labourers living in modest apartments near their place of work. The area is home to much illicit trading and gang activity, and it's a favourite spot of Rakdos performers, who know their audience. The Dead Bridge Chasm, which bisects the precinct, peers down into the Golgari-controlled depths of the Undercity below. And it's a favourite spot for overworlders to dump bodies and other waste you might want to clear away after a murder or similarly violent night occurrence. Despite the occasionally patrolling Boros and Azorius, the area is notoriously dangerous at night, when, alongside the gangs, unknown horrors and undead monsters rise from the chasm or other lurking places to terrorize the poor residents of the precinct. No one welcomes his visit, yet all must grant him tribute. Now, having lower income and being guildless don't necessarily go hand in hand, but it is far more common for the ungilded to be presented as such. It's implied that some citizens of all classes in each precinct are guildless, but given how the majority of the power on the plane still resides with the guilds, it's amongst the poor where their numbers would be greatest. For example, despite the D&D book noting how the guildless operate many non-gilded industries on the plane,
It also notes how many of the warehouses in Precinct 6 are Orzhov owned.
guildless workers operating inside guild-controlled organizations and properties is something I can imagine being very commonplace on Ravnica.
Despite the mix of guildless and gilded people in all of the city's precincts, we can see how the guilds still dominate each area, and there are a few places in the city that the guildless can truly call their own. Whilst I'm sure the guilds operate many of their own schools and academies, etc., education does seem to be a field that's less partisan than many on the plane. As I mentioned in the Demir chapter, the Ismari library that offers vast amounts of knowledge to the public is officially ungilded, even if the unseen house can be regularly not seen there. The D&D book uses this art from Destroy the Evidence for the library, but the library is not destroyed, so imagine this, but without the destroying. And Prism University, also in Precinct 5, is a place where budding mages can study the vastly varied magic of their world, unfocused by guild specialization. The university also boasts guild neutrality, though it's an open secret that many guilds are already embedded in the institution, with the goal of funneling graduates into their ranks. Mentioned on 2 Vidalcan cards across the last 2 Ravnica blocks, Sage's Row seems to be an area particularly associated with guild rejection, and at least some of its denizens are keen to reapply the skills they learned working under the guilds, practically, to improve their lives and those of those around them. I offer you wisdom untainted by false loyalty, learning free of any guild's agenda. This card got reprinted in Core Set 2020 and the flavor was changed, but it's just paraphrasing the previous flavor text. Forget what you have learned from other teachers. I bring you the truth. Why? Anyway, Sage's Row may be one of few locales associated with the Guildless that's actually mentioned on the cards. But the Azorius short story introduced us to an area of Ravnica where no guild holds dominion. The Think Tank Enclave is a ramshackle collection of dwellings and laboratories built atop a growing garbage island, jutting from the edge of a river in the 10th. A group of ex-ISIT members developed the place to continue their experiments outside the, stifling constraints of the League. 4 guilds used to claim ownership of the startup settlement, and with none more clearly deserving than the others, Azorius law couldn't resolve the dispute and prevented any guild from taking any action within the think tank. The naive and idealistic Azorius lawmaker, Reza, that we follow in this story is uncharacteristically good-intentioned when compared to his guild's presentation elsewhere, and provides a humanizing view of the Senate, whilst being a Vidalcan. After accidentally getting stuck at the think tank, Reza comes to like the plucky people of the garbage town, and utilizes his knowledge and power of Azorius law to actually help them. With the junk town about to be destroyed by a rogue elemental, and the Azorius forces standing by, unable to act because of their own nonsense laws, Reza uses his law magic to grant the think tank its own sovereignty. As an independent city-state, partitioned within the 10th district, the waiting Azorius army was finally able to charge into the think tank and save it from the raging elemental. As defense contractors or something. Regardless, not only did an Azorius member use the law to provide positive change to someone for once, they also technically created a guildless city. Now, everyone there is a disgruntled ex-League member, and the think tank is essentially an ISIT lab in everything but official status. But the Azorius-approved leader of the tank, Grand Arbiter Hendrik Amzarak, is a member of the tank and a guildless citizen. As far as gilded jurisdiction is concerned, the think tank enclave is independent guildless territory. Now, whether it will remain that way, or if that in of itself bodes ill for the people of the tank, we have yet to see. Although my pessimistic guess is that it'll never be mentioned again. Either way, it shows that it is possible for the Guildless to eke out a shred of power, but only by utilizing the flaws and loopholes that can exist within their entrenched system.
During Return to Ravnica, the Guildless underwent a redesign, and that block's art director laid out in relatively extensive detail how ungilded attire was changed, and showed off some of the style guide pages that became the foundations for the Guildless look going forward. This time, whilst all the guilds had a couple of their style guide pages made publicly available online, far less info came alongside them, and no pages were provided at all for the Guildless. So I can't confidently tell you whether the aesthetic of the Guildless of Guilds of Ravnica block was developed from a set of new style guide pages or was working off the same ones as RTR. The rough and ready practicality that contrasts to elaborate guild attire is still at the forefront and still evoked through muted, often non-guild colors. Their clothing still emulates the forms seen in the previous style guide. There's a lot of diagonal lines bisecting torsos, big lapels and padded shoulders remain a fixture, and the cloaks that reference the Guildless Clove's reworked Planeswalker origins are even more prevalent than before. I'd say that the Living Guild Pact made them fashionable, but nobody likes him, so I don't think that's true. If there is one shift in presentation, then it's towards evoking the season, and less Guildless skin is exposed now, in favor of heavy jackets, scarves, pelts, and hoods to keep out the creeping chill. Much like how they've been used in the past, the Guildless of Guilds of Ravnica block do an excellent job expressing the relatability and mundanity of Fantasy City life. Good at carrying things, really good at knocking them down. Fairies are easily offended and quick to exact a quirky revenge. Not my first edition of the Advocates of the Urchin! Like before, the Guildless exemplify the city and evoke it in the backgrounds and foregrounds of many cards, whether they are the subject or not. Under the current climate of guild-induced fear, their cards are quick to remind us of the pressure being applied at street level. Citizen, your crime has been recorded. Cease movement and await arrest, or further penalties will be immediately imposed. They've got eyes inside my head. As the Guildless convey to us a day-to-day that is increasingly being encroached upon, the anti-guild sentiment that ran throughout the Guildless in the previous blocks has also returned. No guilds, that is her rule. The House Vampires unnerve her, the Combine would dissect her, the Legion burn her,
The Conclave cure her. The shadows are all the family she needs.
And more prevalent than before is the idea that the guilds just aren't a good fit for Ravnica's guildless people, who feel constrained by them.
I spent some time in the Legion, but I'm done taking orders all day.
The streets of Ravnica are full of former guild members, now using their institutional skills for personal gain. Like with most themes associated with the Guildless, their rejection of the guilds was still present in the previous blocks. But in Guilds of Ravnica it takes greater precedent than ever, even over their typical victim status. As much as we can still find them being presented as the prey or collateral of the guilds, you're much more likely to find them denouncing the guilds, evading them, and doing their jobs for them. When the established order falters, what remains are ordinary people and their struggle to survive. I particularly love how Hero of Precinct 1's rules text evokes its flavor. Whenever you cast a multicolored spell, create a 1/1 white human creature token. Making a guildless human token whenever you play a multicolored gilded spell seems counterintuitive to the point it's making, but it's a cast trigger, meaning that your ungilded token responder is on the scene before your gilded spell can even resolve. It isn't obvious whether Hero of Precinct 1 is a member of the Hasda, the guildless volunteer police force that appeared in the two previous blocks, but the Hasda are back.
You two cover the alley! You, with me! Eyes on windows, balconies and rooftops! Who knows what a fish octopus crab can do?
I love Hasda officer's expression in Aaron Miller's art here. I can't not imagine him sounding at least a little bit like the Mace Men from Stronghold.
What a lousy job!
And Hasda Marshal's flavor drives home a similar point to Hero of Precinct 1's. Ravnica's convoluted power structure often boils down to who can muster the most swords on a given block. As the guildless increasingly take things into their own hands, perhaps the guild's control at the micro level is less absolute than we might have assumed. Only 2 cards this block bear the Hasda name, but many more potentially depict them. Although they don't show up in any of the text outside of the cards this block, which is a bit of a shame, as we don't get any context for the modern structure of the volunteer group. Given how much the guilds have been restructured, you might imagine the Hasda have had their own internal shifts. But their cards and potential cards do hammer home the need for and effectiveness of the Hasda more than ever. The guild masters loom large in the political sphere, but in the end, the rulers of Ravnica are its people. This is a more optimistic assessment than I feel is justified by the rest of this block's presentation of Ravnica, but it does a good job demonstrating how the presentation of the Guildless has shifted over the years to afford them more agency. Rally to Battle's Guildless warriors aren't necessarily Hasda, though they are backed by Guildless angels flying overhead. The creation of angels on Ravnica is a product of the Boros Legion, and all angels have at least a history with the guild. We saw last block that the Legion was losing some of its angels to the Gateless movement, and whilst the Guildless angels have returned for the block, the Gateless haven't. The group of anti-guild rebels that were introduced in Return to Ravnica aren't mentioned at all this block, and it is a shame. I probably got more annoyed than I needed to in the previous video about the lack of focus given to the Gateless. But no focus at all is not better than a little bit, and I'm sad that they're not mentioned at all this time. What the fate of the group is, and whether they even persist or not, we have no idea. One of the Gateless cards did get a reprint in Modern Masters 2017 with new flavor and art, so there is that. Outside of goblin gangs, with the Gateless missing, the Hasda are all we get for guildless organization this block, save potentially for Priest of Forgotten Gods. The Orzhov are not the only religious tradition on Ravnica, nor the oldest. The macabre cleric is perhaps a member of the Cult of Yore, who we haven't seen since the first block but worshipped the ancient Nephilim, who reside somewhere beneath the streets. The priest might not be connected to the cult though, and Ravnica does have some other strange beings given little focus that could fit the bill for forgotten gods. But the priest's comparison to the Orzhov demonstrates another increased theme of the Guildless this block. Not just rejecting the guilds, but surpassing them and flourishing outside of them. Sometimes an angel passes by and gives me a little nod like, "You're a daring one." That always makes my day. More so than in either of the previous Ravnica blocks, the presentation of the Guildless has elevated to place them adjacent to the guilds rather than under heel. Alongside the mundane relatability that more readily characterized the Guildless in Return to Ravnica is a presentation that sees ungilded people as exceptional. People at the top of their field. People whose craft or ideals would only be limited by their inclusion in a guild. She memorized every arcane text in the Ismeri library by the time she was 16. Now she quizzes sphinxes in her spare time. The trouble with youths these days is that in outright defiance of their elders, they refuse to be bought. Karlov of the Ghost Council.
A common from Ravnica allegiance, Persistent Petitioners demonstrates this newfound guildless power. The Ungilded group are currently locked in a tense verbal battle with someone out of frame. Alongside his incredible talent, artist Jason Rainville clearly put an immense amount of thought into this piece, and on his Twitter, he went into some depth about his process. He shows how his composition leads your eye to the most important piece of the group's gathered evidence, and gives us insight into their unique attire. The form of the costuming was of Azorius bureaucrats, but the colouring and materials was guildless. Was like trying to do a piece of clothing a dwarf made for an elf. Our petitioners look almost Azorius because they've come prepared and clad themselves in their best courtly attire. The card is one of a few magic cards that allow you to run any number of them in your deck, and the petitioners get stronger the more you have, dismantling your opponent's arguments and libraries even quicker together. And I love how the mechanics of the card marry with the lore connected to the Guildless. The petitioners are utilising one of the core strengths of the Ungilded, their raw numbers. Learning the same lesson as whatever the protagonist of A Bug's Life was called. The petitioners are greater together, and even the tangled web of Azorius legislation can be unwound if the Guildless can just get enough signatures. I can't help but picture the petitioners' out-of-frame interlocutors as the droning bureaucrats from the original Ravnica block. It just fits so well, and there's 3 of them even. But it's hard to imagine any Guildless putting up such an affront to the Azorius Senate back then. There's an immense gap between the power of the white-blue lawmakers and the Guildless, but Persistent Petitioners shows us that by employing their inherent strengths and excelling past the guilds at their own game, the Ungilded can even counter the masters of the system that places them under heel. Perhaps there's a bit of a clash between how the Guildless are presented to us and how their situation is described by the rest of the setting this time around. The Guildless have never had so much respect and agency afforded to them. But the inter-guild tension of the current climate paints us a picture of daily lives being ever more stifled by guild paranoia and overreach. How can Ravnica's choking political atmosphere allow for such increased expressions of individuality and freedom? The Ungilded's potentially worsening situation hasn't driven them further into their role as victims, but instead forced many of them to evolve to escape the city's tightening net. Not shying away in response, but leaning further into themselves. Evading where they can't stand in open dismissal or opposition. Overall, this disparity between situation and presentation works, and serves to present the exemplary Ungilded as even more bold, enduring, and exceptional.
The Guildless style guide pages that were developed last block were fantastic for providing a varied framework for artists to build off of, and inject their own expressions of personality into the group. I think the many artists model that WotC uses to produce the art for their sets is next to perfect for presenting a group as varied as the general populace. With so many artists providing their own unique approaches, the individuality of individual members of the Guildless shines through. Whilst the style guide maintains consistency throughout and stops the individual expression from running off into the disparate nonsense of the original Guildless. The Guildless of Guilds of Ravnica block are a beautifully varied collection of relatable perspectives, expressing the varied experiences of Ravnica that players had and what he sought to draw on.
Original aesthetic disparity aside,
in many ways the Guildless are less monolithic every time we see them, and here their presentation ranges all the way from condemnable to pitiable to relatable to aspirational. And it's that variety that makes them feel realer than ever. Guilds of Ravnica wanted to remind its players of their nostalgia for Ravnica, or create it in them. It wanted to present an idealized Ravnica as a real place full of real people that the player base could find themselves amongst. The homely feelings ran throughout both sets and sought not just to sell cards, but to bring Ravnica closer than ever. And as the autumnal city plucks at our nostalgia, its structure and function given even more consideration, the guilds are presented with increasing relatability, and the Guildless offer common folk perspectives as varied and uncommon as the varied commoners of our own world. Ravnica feels not just like a real place, but somewhere deeply familiar. And obviously, that's in part due to this being the third go of things, but that reality was incredibly effectively complemented
by the deepening push into realism and the coming home sentiment baked into Guilds of Ravnica block.
and by providing the most accessible window into the city, now in more flavors than ever.
Windows have flavors, go and lick one! I'm great at analogies.
The Ungilded are amongst the biggest contributors to that perception, and to the increasingly grounded presentation of Ravnica. Simultaneous to the Ungilded contributions, the sensibilities of the Guildless have been applied to Ravnica on the whole, wherein the Guildless are excellent at providing relatability to Ravnica's audience. And now the city and the guilds have been crafted with that same accessibility more readily in mind. Ravnica's more guildless than ever! Hooray! And not like the guildless era from the previous video, I'm talking about relatable presentation. Although Ravnica is more guildless than ever in more ways than one. As well as being more relatable, for the first time, Ravnica itself is being used as a tool in a grander scheme. Both by the invading Bolas and by Wizards of the Coast, picking it as the backdrop for the finale of their grand narrative. For as we know, all of everything we've seen, the reshaping of the guilds and the guildless and their approachably presented world, all of it is here to serve the greater point of focus. The true function of Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance is to prime the setting for war. To set all the pieces carefully in place and to remind us of our investment in Ravnica before its future is made uncertain. And whilst Ravnica has remained center stage for 2 sets now, the real star of the show only arrives in the 3rd act. In War of the Spark, the topic of the next video in this series, everything comes to a head. With Ravnica more divided than ever, Bolas has arrived and brought with him multitudinous legions. He stuck a giant fortress right in the heart of the 10th and intends to conquer far more than just poor old Ravnica. More planeswalkers than have ever appeared in a single set have showed up to stop him, but even that seems to be part of the dragon's plan. Can the city hope to free itself from the vice-like grip of his dominion? Who shall prevail in the war for the plane? Will the story manage to live up to the amassing hype? And whatever the outcome, what will befall all those ordinary people caught in the middle? Join me next time when the story of Ravnica actually comes to a close. Or at least this one does. There will definitely be more Ravnica sets.
Like that brand new one.
And there's some stuff which comes after War of the Spark, which I'll cover in the next video as well. I don't know why I used the phrase comes to a close. It made no sense when I said it last time, and I'm just saying it now to reference the fact that I used it before. Why? Regardless, let's meet again when the world is at war. Hello! Welcome to the end. I think I've said every version of welcome to the outro at this point. Well, thanks for watching to the end of the video. Sorry it took a while, I'm glad we're all here now. Remember to like this video, I think it helps. I'm told it helps. Subscribe to this channel if you're not already. Touch the bell, which is there. Press the bell button, and then just turn off notifications for YouTube. I don't know. Actually, do I want you to have the bell? I guess it's good. I don't really care whether you get notifications, but it's probably better for me that you have the bell. So, yeah. I don't think I have any channels with the bell on, though. I'm afraid I'm a hypocrite. Anyway, maybe I won't leave that in. Maybe we'll cut that out. This took a lot of time, and I'll get into that in a minute. This was the longest Guildless video, and a lot of the stuff in it maybe wasn't, and I guess some of the stuff in it maybe seemed tangential to the Guildless, which I do understand, but, I think having the Guildless be a lens rather than the focus of the topic is better, makes for better videos, basically. And using that angle to examine everything in Ravnica per each period we see it is, what I want to do, really. So I'm probably going to do that for the next, what will be 2 Guildless videos now, because the series that never gets longer. So yes, I will probably keep them as expansive. I realized, looking at Guildless 1 versus Guildless 2, I liked 1 better because it was more, complete, I guess, I felt. That's probably how we're going to make the rest of the series going forward. Apologies if you'd prefer shorter things that just focused specifically only on the Guildless cards, etc., then, I don't know, make your own series. What do you want me to say? What's on my notes of things I need to say in this little bit? So yes, Guildless 4 will cover War of the Spark. That is my next video. I'm not gonna, fuck around and make a bunch of other stuff, because I do have ideas for other videos, but none. I just want to get this series done now after, taking a break off, and also looking backwards at Magic sets. Even War of the Spark is quite nostalgic at the minute, rather than dwelling on what Magic currently is, which makes me less happy. Although that said, I do like the look of Karlov Manor a lot. I haven't actually played with any of the cards yet. As I am recording this, it's about a week before the set comes out, I think. So we've seen all the previews, etc. And I really like the look of it. I'm not going to do a short video just like I have done for some of the other Magic sets, or one Magic set, and then I failed to make a short one for March of the Machine. Well, anyway, I'm not going to do an off script video for Karlov Manor, because it deserves its own proper Guildless video, basically. So that Guildless 5 will be Karlov Manor. Guildless 4 will be War of the Spark and March of the Machine, and maybe a couple of other little bits that fit between those two. I'm toying with the idea of, I don't really have enough money to do it, but I'm toying with the idea of paying editors, which would be, or an editor or whatever, just like, paying someone else to do the bulk of the editing. The only problem is, I'll have to work out very specifically how this works, or they'll have to know, like, tons about magic as well, like, pretty much know everything I'm referring to, in the script. So, I'm toying with the idea. So apologies for the slow upload rate, I'm trying to address it. And quadruply sorry, if you're a patron of mine. And honestly, thank you so much for your support and for sticking around while I struggle. So yeah, thank you immensely, patrons, and let's thank them officially as well. Thank you so much. I don't have a different way to say thank you. This whole outro is just me referencing the fact that I've said everything I'm about to say in it before. Thank you so much, my Brass Squire and Parcelmere patrons. These are the names of all those delightful people. An additional thank you for you. I hope you lot enjoyed watching Guildless 3 early in parts, which is a thing I did and I'm probably going to do again for Guildless 4. And an even bigger, extra special, warm and uncomfortably close thank you to all of my patrons rolling around in the battlesphere, including Yakub, Sebastian Rees, Storfitting, Marshall Mere, Eric Vaughan, Librarian of Leng, Santiago Adia, Chonga, King of the Mole Men, and Patrick Dane. And if you want your name here in some form or another, come and join me on Patreon to see a few bits and catch Guildless 4 early in chunks as it's finished. Do I have anything else I need to address in this outro? I just wrote a joke or something. This is my last bullet point.